My name is Lyra Robert, and I am 28 years old. 3 nights ago, my father sat at the head of a private dining table in one of Santa Fe's most exclusive restaurants, pointed his silver salad fork at my chest, and told me to stop playing artist. The room smelled of roasted pine and expensive reserve wine, but all I could focus on was the sound of his laughter. He laughed right in front of my sister and their corporate friends, announcing to the table that my grace period for finding myself had officially expired. He told me it was time to stop being a financial burden, to grow up, and to build actual equity. He used my sister Victoria, a newly promoted vice president of a tech firm, as the ultimate standard of American success. I sat there in my simple black dress, my hands folded in my lap. They looked at the faint traces of cadmium red paint permanently stained into my cuticles, like I was a tragic mistake they were forced to endure. They thought I was just a naive girl, wasting my youth hauling heavy canvases in a dusty, unair-conditioned studio off Canyon Road. They assumed my life was a series of failed craft fairs, unpaid bills, and foolish dreams. They were wrong. What my father did not know, as he patronizingly tapped his heavy gold Rolex with his fork and lectured me about the value of time, was that my time had already paid off. Earlier that morning, the escrow had cleared on a sprawling architectural mural I had spent 6 months painting. I had not just sold a piece of art, I had sold it to an international collector for $1.2 million. My personal bank account currently held more liquid capital than my father's entire commercial real estate firm generated in a fiscal quarter. When my gallery director called me in the middle of that dinner to officially confirm the wire transfer, I did not excuse myself. I did not step outside into the crisp New Mexico air. I placed the phone in the exact center of the white linen tablecloth and hit the speaker button. Before I tell you what those few words sounded like echoing through that quiet dining room, and why the smug color drained from my father's face, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Morning Revenge. Drop a comment below and let me know your age and where you are watching from tonight. Now let me take you back to the beginning of that dinner, right before the illusion of my family's superiority shattered forever. The private dining room at La Tierra felt less like a celebration and more like a corporate audit. Thick adobe walls muffled the ambient jazz from the main floor, leaving only the soft crackle of the Kiva fireplace and the sharp clink of crystal wine glasses. My father, William, had reserved the space to honor Victoria. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table, swirling a heavy California Cabernet, surveying the room like a king inspecting his territory. William was a commercial real estate developer. He saw the world purely in zoning permits, tax brackets, and profit margins. To him, the vibrant, deeply spiritual art culture of New Mexico was nothing more than a convenient aesthetic backdrop used to sell high-end condos to out-of-state buyers. He respected money. He respected titles. He did not respect me. I sat near the middle of the table, wearing a simple black dress that felt invisible next to my sister. Victoria wore a tailored navy blazer with sharp shoulders, her posture rigid and perfect. She wore her new corporate title like a suit of armor, Vice President of Strategic Operations. The words tasted metallic just thinking about them. She offered me a practiced, sympathetic tilt of her head every time my father directed his disappointment my way. The appetizers had barely been cleared when the interrogation began. William set his glass down, the stem hitting the wood with a dull thud. "Stop playing artist, Lyra," he stated, his voice cutting through the polite chatter. He did not bother making eye contact with me. He was too busy signaling the sommelier for a refill. "You are 28 years old. The grace period for finding yourself expired 5 years ago." I kept my eyes on my sparkling water, watching the bubbles rise to the surface. I had spent the last 7 years grinding in my studio. I mixed my own pigments, inhaled turpentine until my lungs ached, and hauled heavy canvas frames until my knuckles bled. I did not need a lecture on hard work from a man whose greatest physical exertion was signing a deed with an expensive pen. "Dad has a point," Victoria chimed in, slicing a piece of her prime rib with surgical precision. "A hobby is fine for the weekends, but it is time to build a real foundation. You cannot build a future on craft fairs and wishful thinking. You need a real job." I bit the inside of my cheek, tasting copper. "It is not a hobby, Victoria. I work 60-hour weeks. I have gallery representation." William let out a short, dismissive breath. "Representation at some boutique off Canyon Road does not pay the mortgage, Lyra. It is just paint. It is not scalable business. Look at your sister, VP by 30. She has stock options. She has a retirement portfolio. She has a title that commands respect in the real world. That is what success looks like." He picked up his silver salad fork. He turned his wrist, exposing the heavy gold face of his Rolex, and tapped the crystal dial with the metal tines. Click, click, click. "This is what you are losing," he said, the sound sharp and jarring against the quiet elegance of the room. "Time. The window for a real career closes fast. Every day you spend smearing colors on a canvas is a day you fall further behind. You are becoming a liability to your own future." The word liability hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. That was how my family viewed me, an unpaid debt, a stain on their pristine corporate ledger. I looked around the table. My mother kept her eyes fixed on her plate, refusing to intervene, as always. Victoria offered me another one of those sickeningly sweet, pitying smiles. I felt the familiar heat of shame prickle the back of my neck, but I forced it down. I refused to let them see me sweat. I focused on the sensory details of the room to ground myself. The rough texture of the linen napkin in my lap, the smoky scent of the burning pine, the cold condensation slipping down the side of my water glass. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and flip the table to tell them that they understood nothing about value, about creation, about the multi-million-dollar reality of the fine art industry that thrived right in their own backyard. But I knew better. Screaming was what they expected. Screaming would just confirm their belief that I was an emotional, unstable artist who could not handle the pressure of the real world. So I sat there, in silence. I endured the condescension. I let my father dissect my life choices, listening as he weaponized my sister's corporate ascent to highlight my perceived failures. I let him paint the picture of my life as a tragic, cautionary tale. "We just want what is best for you, Lyra," Victoria added, her tone dripping with false concern. "We want you to be secure. If you ever need help looking over a resume for an entry-level position, my human resources department is always hiring administrative staff. It would be a step down, but it is a start." Administrative staff. I stared at her, marveling at the sheer arrogance. She genuinely believed her heavily leveraged tech startup was the pinnacle of human achievement. She had no idea that true wealth did not always wear a navy blazer. I reached for my water glass, my hand remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I took a slow sip. "Thank you, Victoria," I said quietly. "I will keep that in mind." William nodded, satisfied with my apparent surrender. "Good. It is time to join reality." He went back to his steak, shifting the conversation to commercial interest rates and zoning boards. The tension at the table dissolved into polite, meaningless corporate jargon. They had put me in my place. The natural order of the Robert family was restored. The successful daughter was celebrated, and the disappointment was properly managed. I let out a slow, quiet breath, letting the ambient noise wash over me. I was not angry anymore. I just felt a cold, clinical detachment. I was studying them the way I would study a still life before painting it. I saw the rigid lines of their ambition, the dark shadows of their arrogance. I knew their structure intimately, and I knew exactly how fragile it truly was. Deep inside my clutch, resting against the soft fabric lining my phone screen, remained dark. But I knew what was coming. I had been waiting for the confirmation all evening. The paperwork was signed. The wire transfer had been initiated hours ago in Madrid. It was only a matter of time before the digital ledger settled, and the call came through. William ordered another bottle of wine, laughing loudly at a joke one of his colleagues made. Victoria checked her smartwatch, nodding importantly at a notification. They were so comfortable in their superiority. Then my clutch vibrated. A single, sustained pulse. I did not move immediately. I let it vibrate a second time, then a third. I unclasped the small purse and reached inside. My fingers brushed the cool metal edge of the phone. I pulled it out and turned the screen toward me. Elias, the gallery director. I took a breath, letting the scent of the roasted pine fill my lungs one last time before the atmosphere of the room changed forever. I looked at my father, who was still laughing, his gold Rolex catching the warm firelight. I slid my thumb across the screen to answer. The morning sun crested the Sangre de Cristo foothills, casting long shadows across the uneven terracotta tiles of my studio floor. I stood at my heavy wooden work table, a steel palette knife in my hand, blending raw umber into a pool of titanium white. The scrape of metal against the glass palette was usually my favorite sound in the world. It was the sound of control, the sound of building something from nothing. But today, the rhythm offered no peace. My phone sat on the edge of the table, vibrating every few minutes. The screen illuminated the dusty air, displaying a relentless stream of notifications. I wiped my hands on a paint-splattered rag and picked up the device. There were 4 text messages from my father. The man who had not initiated a conversation with me in 6 months, unless it was to criticize my lifestyle, was suddenly overflowing with paternal urgency. "Good morning, sweetheart," the first message read. "I know last night ended abruptly. We were all just surprised. I have cleared my morning schedule. We need to discuss asset protection immediately. Do not sign any disbursement documents with your gallery until my legal team reviews the terms." The second message arrived 10 minutes later. "Lyra, please acknowledge you received this. High net worth individuals are targets. You are out of your depth here. Let me handle the structural side." Sweetheart. He had not called me that since I was 12 years old. The word looked alien on the screen. A poorly fitting mask slipped over his usual corporate rigidity. I stared at the bright pixels, remembering a very different conversation we had in his downtown office 10 years ago. I was 18, clutching a folder of college acceptance letters and federal loan guarantor forms. I had earned a partial scholarship to a prestigious design institute, but I needed a co-signer for the remainder of the tuition. William had sat behind his polished oak desk, tenting his fingers, looking at me with the same cold calculation he reserved for zoning inspectors. He did not even open the folder. He slid it back across the desk. "Fine art is a bad investment," he had said, his voice flat and final. "I do not fund hobbies, Lyra. If you want a business degree, I will write the check today. If you insist on this bohemian fantasy, you will finance it yourself. I will not put my name on a loan for a career that guarantees poverty." He had drawn his boundary. He had made it clear that his support was conditional, tied directly to my willingness to become a carbon copy of him. So I walked out of his office. I worked closing shifts at a coffee shop. I cleaned brushes at a local community center. I spent winters in an unheated garage wearing 2 coats while I painted because I could not afford to pay for both art supplies and a heated apartment. I built my career on grit, blistered hands, and sheer force of will entirely without his safety net. Now, staring at his text messages, the irony was thick enough to choke on. The man who refused to co-sign a small student loan was now demanding control over a 7-figure payout. He was trying to retroactively claim a stake in a victory he had actively tried to sabotage. Have you ever watched someone who actively tried to drown you suddenly offer to teach you how to swim just because they saw a rescue boat approaching? If you have ever had a family member who only remembered your existence when you became profitable, drop a comment below and share your story. I read every single one. I set the phone down, ignoring the texts. I picked up my palette knife, trying to focus on the smooth texture of the oil paint. I needed the sensory grounding. I needed the smell of the linseed oil and the familiar weight of the tools in my hands. This studio was my sanctuary. It was the only place in Santa Fe where I made the rules. 10 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail notification from Victoria. I tapped the play button, putting it on speaker so I could keep working. Lyra picked up Victoria's voice echoed through the sunlit room. She sounded frantic, the polished vice president persona frayed around the edges. Dad is pacing holes in the carpet. You cannot just walk out of a dinner and ignore us when you have a taxable event of this size pending. You do not understand how capital gains work. You are going to lose half of that money to the government if we do not structure a corporate entity for you today. My firm uses a wealth manager who specializes in sudden windfalls. Call me back the second you get this. We are trying to protect you. I stopped mixing the paint. I looked at the audio waveform dancing across the screen. We are trying to protect you. The translation was painfully obvious. We are trying to control you. Victoria had spent her entire adult life treating me like an embarrassing secret. She excluded me from her networking events, telling her colleagues I was just going through a phase. She built her entire identity on being the successful, pragmatic daughter. My sudden elevation to a millionaire shattered her worldview. She needed to assert dominance to prove she was still the financial expert, the older sister who knew best. She wanted to position herself as the architect of my wealth, so she would not have to admit I had surpassed her. I deleted the voicemail. The digital trash can icon swallowed her voice, restoring the quiet to my studio. I walked over to the large arched window facing the street. The morning air in New Mexico is sharp and clear, carrying the faint scent of dry sagebrush. I watched a few early tourists wandering down Canyon Road, peering into the high-end galleries. They saw the glamour, the polished bronze sculptures, the expensive price tags. They did not see the years of rejection, the silent panic attacks over unpaid rent, the relentless pressure to abandon the craft. My family had seen all of that struggle, and they had turned their backs. Now that the struggle had produced gold, they were standing at the gates, bags in hand, ready to move into the estate they refused to help build. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I was not the naive 18-year-old girl sitting in William's office anymore. I was a businesswoman. I understood the value of my work, and more importantly, I understood the true nature of the people sharing my bloodline. They dealt in leverage. They respected power. If they wanted to treat my life like a corporate merger, I was ready to play by their rules. I would not scream. I would not argue. I would secure my assets with the same clinical ruthlessness my father used to acquire real estate. I pulled up my contacts list, scrolling past my family members, searching for a specific number. Patricia. She was a senior estate attorney based in downtown Santa Fe, known for drafting ironclad trusts and dismantling hostile takeovers. I had met her at a gallery opening 2 years ago, and we had stayed in touch. She was brilliant, expensive, and entirely devoid of sentimentality. I needed a fortress. I needed legal boundaries so rigid my father could not break them with a sledgehammer. Before I could hit the call button, a heavy, sharp thud echoed through the studio. Someone was knocking on my front door. It was not the polite, rhythmic tap of a delivery driver or a neighboring artist coming to borrow supplies. It was a loud, authoritative pounding, the kind of knock that demanded immediate entry. The heavy wooden door rattled in its iron hinges. I froze my thumb, hovering over the screen. My studio was unlisted. I kept the address private specifically to avoid unannounced visitors while I was working. The only people who knew this location were my gallery director, my landlord, and my family. The knocking resumed, louder this time. Lyra, a voice muffled by the thick adobe walls, shouted, "Open the door!" It was Victoria. The charm offensive was over. The urgent texts and voicemails had failed to secure my compliance, so the Vice President of Strategic Operations had decided to breach my sanctuary in person. I slipped the phone into the back pocket of my denim apron. I picked up a clean rag, slowly wiping the raw umber paint from my fingers. I took my time, letting her wait on the other side of the heavy wood, letting the tension build in the cool morning air. I knew this was not going to be a congratulatory visit. This was going to be a hostile invasion. I walked across the uneven tiles, the sound of my boots echoing in the large room, ready to face the sister who thought she could dictate the terms of my life. To ensure the storyline progresses smoothly while hitting the required word count and adhering to your stylistic rules, I will seamlessly blend the thematic elements of Section 3, the invoice of love, and the morning reflections directly into the conflict of Section 4, Victoria's ambush, and the revelation of the fraud. This keeps the narrative driving forward without stalling on pure exposition. I stood in front of the heavy oak door of my studio, listening to my sister pound her fist against the wood. The sound echoed through the large space, a harsh intrusion into my sanctuary. I did not turn the deadbolt immediately. I took a moment to look around the room. The morning light poured through the skylights, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Canvases in various stages of completion leaned against the plaster walls. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil was thick and comforting. This was the empire I had built with my own blistered hands. For 28 years, my family had operated on a very specific economic model. I called it the invoice of love. Every meal provided, every roof over my head during childhood, every basic parental duty was tallied in a hidden ledger. William and Victoria did not give affection. They extended credit. And when I chose to become a painter instead of a corporate drone, my credit was officially revoked. They treated my existence as a bad investment that needed to be written off. Now that I was suddenly wealthy, they were trying to collect on a debt I never owed. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. Victoria did not wait for an invitation. She pushed past me, bringing the frantic energy of a failing corporate executive into my quiet workspace. She was wearing an $800 cream silk blouse and a tailored black blazer, looking entirely absurd, standing on my paint-splattered terracotta floor. She surveyed the room, her eyes darting across the unfinished murals, calculating their monetary value, instead of seeing the art. "You took your time opening the door," Victoria said, her breath slightly uneven. "I was working," I replied, crossing my arms over my denim apron. "My phone has been vibrating all morning. Dad left 4 messages. You left a rather frantic voicemail about wealth managers. I thought I made it clear last night that I do not need the family firm to handle my finances." Victoria offered a tight, patronizing smile. She walked toward my main work table, running a manicured fingernail along the edge of a clean palette. She was trying to regain the high ground, trying to play the wise older sister. "We were just surprised, Lyra," Victoria said softly. "You have to admit, selling a single piece for over $1 million is an anomaly. We want to make sure you are not being taken advantage of by these gallery types. Family protects family. Family protects family." The phrase sounded synthetic coming from her mouth. I remembered a winter 5 years ago when I had pneumonia. I had called Victoria asking for a $50 loan to buy antibiotics because my account was overdrawn. She had told me that bailing me out would only enable my irresponsible lifestyle, and she hung up. A neighbor ended up buying the medicine for me. Before we go any further, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had a relative who watched you drown in a glass of water, only to show up with a life raft the second they realized you learned how to walk on it? If you know what it feels like to receive a bill for conditional love, leave a comment and share your story. Let me know I am not the only one. I stepped away from the door, keeping my distance from her. "Cut the charm, Victoria. You did not drive across town at 8 in the morning in your designer clothes to check on my well-being. What do you want?" Her tight smile vanished, replaced by the cold, pragmatic expression she usually reserved for boardroom negotiations. She stopped pretending to look at my art and turned to face me. "I need a bridge loan," she stated. The sheer audacity of the request hung in the dusty air. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but her face was deadly serious. "A bridge loan," I repeated. "It is a temporary liquidity issue," Victoria explained, her voice slipping into a rapid, rehearsed corporate pitch. "My tech startup is experiencing a minor cash flow bottleneck. We have receivables coming in next quarter, but I need capital to cover the gap, $300,000. It is a fraction of your windfall. I will draw up the paperwork today. We can set a competitive interest rate." I looked at her perfectly styled hair, her expensive shoes, the luxury SUV parked outside my window. She had spent years treating me like a charity case, mocking my career choices, telling me to get a real job. Now, less than 12 hours after discovering my success, she was standing in my sanctuary, begging for $350,000 to save her own failing vanity project. "You want me to hand over $300,000? I said slowly, letting the reality of her entitlement sink in. "To save a company you have spent the last 3 years bragging about. The same company you used to belittle my life choices just last night. It is not a handout." Victoria snapped, her corporate composure fracturing. "It is an investment. You owe this family. Lyra, Dad financed your entire childhood. We clothed you. We fed you. You have an obligation to support the family legacy, now that you finally have the means to do so. Do not be selfish." The invoice of love had officially been presented. "I do not owe you a dime," I said, my voice dropping to a low, unbreakable cadence. "Dad cut off my college funding because he said art was a bad investment. You refused to help me buy medicine when I was sick. I built this career entirely alone. My money is not a safety net for your mismanagement. The answer is no." Victoria's face turned a mottled shade of red. The polished vice president dissolved into a desperate, furious woman. She took a step toward me, raising her hands in frustration. "You do not understand what is at stake," she yelled, her voice echoing off the plaster walls. "If my startup defaults, the bank is not just coming after my corporate accounts. They are going to seize the Taus property." The words stopped me cold. The Taus property was a historic estate left by our late grandfather. It was placed in a family trust, intended to be passed down to all the grandchildren. It was supposed to be untouchable. Why would the bank seize the trust property? I asked, the pieces of a very dark puzzle beginning to snap together in my mind. Victoria realized her mistake immediately. Her eyes widened, and she took a sudden step backward. Her heel caught the edge of my heavy wooden easel. She stumbled, throwing her arm out to catch her balance. Her sleeve brushed directly against a freshly painted canvas resting on a side table. Thick, wet cadmium red oil paint smeared across the cream silk of her blouse and the sleeve of her $800 black blazer. She looked down at the bright red stain ruining her expensive armor. She let out a sharp cry of disgust, frantically trying to wipe the oil paint away, but she only managed to grind the crimson pigment deeper into the fabric. The visual metaphor was undeniable. The pristine illusion of her corporate success was officially stained by the reality of my art. "You ruined my jacket," she hissed, glaring at me as if I had thrown the paint at her. "I did not touch you," I said, keeping my gaze locked on her face. "Answer the question, Victoria. Why is the bank coming after grandfather's estate? What did Dad do?" "I am not discussing this with you," Victoria stammered, backing toward the door, holding her ruined arm away from her body. "You are just a painter. You do not understand high-level finance. You are making a huge mistake, Lyra. When Dad finds out you refuse to help us, you are going to regret it." She turned and hurried out of the studio, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind her. The sound echoed through the room, leaving me alone in the sudden quiet. I stood there, looking at the smear of red paint on the edge of the canvas. My sister had come to extort me, but she had left behind a thread of truth. High-level finance, a cash flow bottleneck, The Taos property. My father was a commercial real estate developer. He knew better than anyone that you cannot lose a trust property unless it has been illegally leveraged as collateral. If Victoria's failing startup was tied to our grandfather's estate, it meant my father had committed severe financial fraud to fund her corporate vanity project. The dinner last night was not a celebration. It was a masquerade. They were broke, drowning in debt, and my newly acquired wealth was the only lifeline they had left. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. I did not feel sad. I did not feel betrayed. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. They thought they could bully me into submission, relying on old family dynamics and guilt. They had no idea that I was about to use their own arrogance to dismantle everything they thought they owned. I needed to see the ledger. I needed to find the digital paper trail. And once I found it, I was going to prepare a response they would never forget. I stood in front of the heavy oak door of my studio, listening to the rhythmic, demanding thud of my sister knocking. The sound echoed through the large open space, a harsh intrusion into my sanctuary. I did not turn the deadbolt immediately. I took a moment to look around the room. The morning sunlight poured through the overhead skylights, illuminating dust motes dancing in the dry air. Canvases in various stages of completion leaned against the white plaster walls. The scent of turpentine and linseed oil was thick and comforting. This was the empire I had built with my own blistered hands. For 28 years, my family had operated on a very specific economic model. I called it the invoice of conditional love. Every meal provided, every roof over my head during childhood, every basic parental duty was tallied in a hidden ledger. William and Victoria did not give affection, they extended credit. When I chose to become a painter instead of a corporate drone, my credit was officially revoked. They treated my existence as a poor investment that needed to be written off. Now that I was suddenly wealthy, they were trying to collect on a debt I never owed. I turned the brass deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. Victoria did not wait for an invitation. She pushed past me, bringing the frantic energy of a failing executive into my quiet workspace. She wore an $800 cream silk blouse and a tailored black blazer, looking entirely absurd standing on my paint-splattered terracotta floor. She surveyed the room, her eyes darting across the unfinished murals, calculating their monetary value instead of seeing the art. "You took your time opening the door," Victoria said, her breath slightly uneven. "I was working," I replied, crossing my arms over my denim apron. "My phone has been vibrating all morning. Dad left 4 messages. You left a frantic voicemail about wealth managers. I thought I made it clear last night that I do not need the family firm to handle my finances." Victoria offered a tight, patronizing smile. She walked toward my main work table, running a manicured fingernail along the edge of a clean palette. She was trying to regain the high ground, trying to play the wise older sister. "We were just surprised, Lyra," Victoria said softly. "You have to admit, selling a single piece for over $1 million is an anomaly. We want to make sure you are not being taken advantage of by these gallery types. Family protects family." The phrase sounded synthetic coming from her mouth. I remembered a winter 5 years ago when I had pneumonia. I had called Victoria asking for a $50 loan to buy antibiotics because my account was overdrawn. She had told me that bailing me out would only enable my irresponsible lifestyle, and she hung up the phone. A neighboring artist ended up buying the medicine for me. Before we go any further, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had a relative who watched you drown in a glass of water, only to show up with a life raft the second they realized you learned how to walk on it? If you know what it feels like to receive a bill for conditional love, leave a comment and share your story. Let me know I am not the only one. I stepped away from the door, keeping my distance from her. Cut the charm, Victoria. You did not drive across town at 8 in the morning in your designer clothes to check on my well-being. What do you want? Her tight smile vanished, replaced by the cold, pragmatic expression she usually reserved for boardroom negotiations. She stopped pretending to look at my art and turned to face me. I need a bridge loan, she stated. The sheer audacity of the request hung in the dusty air. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but her face was deadly serious. A bridge loan, I repeated. It is a temporary liquidity issue, Victoria explained, her voice slipping into a rapid, rehearsed pitch. My tech startup is experiencing a minor cash flow bottleneck. We have receivables coming in next quarter, but I need capital to cover the gap, $300,000. It is a fraction of your windfall. I will draw up the paperwork today. We can set a competitive interest rate. I looked at her perfectly styled hair, her expensive shoes, the luxury vehicle parked outside my window. She had spent years treating me like a charity case, mocking my career choices, telling me to get a real job. Less than 12 hours after discovering my success, she was standing in my sanctuary, begging for $350,000 to save her own failing vanity project. You want me to hand over $300,000? I said slowly, letting the reality of her entitlement sink in. To save a company you have spent the last 3 years bragging about, the same company you used to belittle my life choices just last night. It is not a handout, Victoria snapped, her corporate composure fracturing. It is an investment. You owe this family, Lyra. Dad financed your entire childhood. We clothed you. We fed you. You have an obligation to support the family legacy now that you finally have the means to do so. Do not be selfish. The invoice of love had officially been presented. I do not owe you a dime, I said, my voice dropping to a low, unbreakable cadence. Dad cut off my college funding because he said art was a poor investment. You refused to help me buy medicine when I was sick. I built this career entirely alone. My money is not a safety net for your mismanagement. The answer is no. Victoria's face turned a mottled shade of red. The polished vice president dissolved into a desperate, furious woman. She took a step toward me, raising her hands in frustration. You do not understand what is at stake, she yelled, her voice echoing off the plaster walls. If your company is failing, that is a structural issue you need to solve with your board of directors, I countered, refusing to match her volume. You spent dinner last night telling me how scalable and secure your life was. You lectured me about building equity. Now you are standing in my studio asking for a bailout. It is not just my company, Victoria screamed, losing all sense of decorum. Her pristine image cracked, revealing the crushing weight of hidden debt she had been carrying. We have leveraged everything to keep the servers running. If I miss payroll this week, the vendors will force us into bankruptcy. That is unfortunate, I said flatly, but it is not my problem. It is your problem, she spat, her eyes wide with panic. If my startup defaults, the bank is not just coming after my corporate accounts. They are going to seize the Taus property. The words stopped me cold. The Taus property was a historic estate left by our late grandfather. It sat on 20 acres of pristine New Mexico landscape. It was placed in a family trust, intended to be passed down to all the grandchildren. The land was sacred to me. It was where I first learned to paint, inspired by the vast skies and rugged mountains. The trust was supposed to be untouchable. Why would the bank seize the trust property? I asked, the pieces of a very dark puzzle beginning to snap together in my mind. Victoria realized her mistake immediately. The blood drained from her face. She took a sudden step backward, wanting to retreat from the confession she had just made. Her heel caught the edge of my heavy wooden easel. She stumbled, throwing her arm out to catch her balance. Her sleeve brushed directly against a freshly painted canvas resting on a side table. It was a study of a desert sunset, thick with wet oils. Thick, wet, cadmium red paint smeared across the cream silk of her blouse and the dark sleeve of her blazer. She looked down at the bright red stain ruining her expensive armor. She let out a sharp cry of disgust, frantically trying to wipe the oil paint away. Her panicked rubbing only managed to grind the crimson pigment deeper into the delicate fabric. The visual metaphor was undeniable. The pristine illusion of her corporate success was officially stained by the reality of my art. "You ruined my jacket," she hissed, glaring at me as if I had thrown the paint at her intentionally. "I did not touch you," I said, keeping my gaze locked on her face. I ignored the ruined clothes. "Answer the question, Victoria. Why is the bank coming after grandfather's estate? What did Dad do?" "I am not discussing this with you," Victoria stammered, backing toward the door, holding her ruined arm away from her body. "You are just a painter. You do not understand high-level finance. You are making a huge mistake, Lyra. When Dad finds out you refuse to help us, you are going to regret it." She turned and hurried out of the studio, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her. The slam echoed through the room, leaving me alone in the sudden quiet. I stood there, looking at the smear of red paint on the edge of the canvas. My sister had come to extort me, but she had left behind a thread of truth, a cash flow bottleneck, a looming bankruptcy, the Taus property. My father was a developer. He knew better than anyone that a bank cannot seize a trust property unless it has been illegally leveraged as collateral. If Victoria's failing startup was tied to our grandfather's estate, it meant my father had committed severe financial fraud to fund her corporate vanity project. The dinner last night was not a celebration. It was a masquerade. They were broke, drowning in debt, and my newly acquired wealth was the only lifeline they had left. I did not feel sad. I did not feel betrayed. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. They thought they could bully me into submission, relying on old family dynamics and guilt. They had no idea that I was about to use their own arrogance to dismantle everything they thought they owned. I needed to see the ledger. I needed to find the digital paper trail to prove what they had done. I sat down at my heavy wooden desk, pushing aside a pile of charcoal sketches and half-empty tubes of raw sienna. I opened my laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across my hands. My fingers were still stained with umber and titanium white. The digital world always felt sterile compared to the tactile reality of canvas and pigment. But today, that cold sterility was exactly what I needed. I opened the web browser and navigated to the family cloud server. William had established a network years ago to distribute tax documents, property deeds, and corporate filings among the family members. He was a man who worshipped organization. He also possessed a terminal case of arrogance. He assumed I was a mathematically illiterate dreamer who would never look past the folders bearing my own name. He believed artists were incapable of understanding structural finance. That assumption was about to become his fatal flaw. I typed in my password and accessed the root directory. Rows of meticulously labeled digital folders populated the screen. They were organized by fiscal year and corporate entity. I bypassed the files dedicated to his commercial real estate firm and scrolled toward the bottom of the list, searching for a specific archive. I found the folder labeled Taos Heritage Trust. My grandfather Thomas had been a traditional New Mexico rancher. He spent his entire life working the arid soil, eventually building a sprawling adobe estate at the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. He despised the corporate world. He often told me that William cared more about the price of dirt than the soul of the land. When my grandfather passed away, he placed the Taos estate into an irrevocable family trust. The legal stipulations were ironclad and unyielding. The property was meant to remain a permanent sanctuary for all the grandchildren. Any financial alteration, any lien, or any sale required the unanimous, notarized consent of every adult beneficiary. That meant William could not touch a single acre of that land without my explicit signature. The property was supposed to be safe. It was the place where I had sketched my first desert landscape, the emotional core of my artistic journey. I clicked on the Taos folder. A long list of PDF documents appeared. Most of them were routine. Property tax receipts, annual maintenance invoices for the adobe walls, utility ledgers. I scrolled past the mundane files, my eyes scanning the dates. Everything looked normal until I reached the records from 2 years ago. There was a sudden gap in the quarterly trust statements. The regular rhythm of the accounting stopped, replaced by a newly created subfolder labeled Commercial Capitalization. My pulse quickened. The steady drumbeat of my heart echoed in my ears. I clicked the new folder. A single document sat inside. It was a scanned PDF titled Bridge Loan Agreement. I opened the file. The document loaded slowly, rendering page after page of dense legal jargon. It was a commercial lending contract from a major regional bank based in Albuquerque. I scrolled through the standard terms and conditions, my eyes searching for the principal amount and the collateral schedule. When I found the numbers, the breath hitched in my throat. The loan was for $3.5 million. The borrower listed on the contract was Victoria's tech startup, and the asset pledged as collateral to secure the debt was the Taos Heritage Trust property. I stared at the screen, letting the reality of the text sink in. The cold blue light reflected in my eyes. William had used our grandfather's historic estate to quietly bail out his favored daughter's failing business. He had bet the only pure thing our family owned on Victoria's corporate vanity project. But a bank would never approve a lien on an irrevocable trust without the consent of all beneficiaries. The underwriting department would demand proof of unanimous agreement. I scrolled past the amortization schedules and the default clauses, navigating straight to the final page of the contract, the signature block. There were 4 lines drawn across the bottom of the page. The first line held William's signature, sharp and angular. The second line belonged to my mother, a faint, wispy script. The third line was Victoria's, executed with heavy, dominant strokes. The fourth line bore my name, Lyra Robert. I leaned closer to the monitor. The visual evidence was stark and undeniable. The digital ink formed the exact loops and curves of my handwriting. But I had never seen this document before today. I had never sat in a room with a notary and authorized the leverage of my grandfather's estate. I examined the pixelation around the signature. It was too clean. The pressure points were uniform, lacking the natural variance of a real pen on paper. William had not just forged my name. He had digitally stripped my signature from an old college application or a previous tax return and grafted it onto a fraudulent commercial loan agreement. A heavy, suffocating silence filled my studio. The air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. My father had committed federal wire fraud and forgery. Victoria was entirely complicit, having accepted millions of dollars in stolen capital to prop up her illusion of success. The jigsaw puzzle from last night finally snapped together, revealing a picture of staggering criminality. The dinner at La Tierra was never about celebrating a promotion. It was a desperate masquerade. Victoria's tech startup was not experiencing a minor cash flow bottleneck. The company was collapsing under the weight of its own debt. If the startup defaulted on the Albuquerque loan, the bank would immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings on the collateral. They would seize the Taos property. More importantly, a default would trigger a comprehensive forensic audit of the loan origination file. The bank examiners would review the trust documents. They would scrutinize the signatures. They would discover the digital forgery. If that tech company went under, William was not just going to lose his prestige. He was going to federal prison. Victoria would lose her career and likely face indictment alongside him. That was why they were panicking. That was why William had abandoned his condescending tone the second he heard about the wire transfer from Madrid. My $1.2 million art sale was not just a sudden windfall they wanted to manage. It was the exact amount of liquid capital they needed to cure the imminent default, satisfy the creditors, and bury the evidence of their felony before the bank auditors arrived. They did not view my success as a triumph. They viewed it as a ransom payment to save their own lives. They expected me to blindly hand over my wealth, framing it as a familial obligation so they could quietly cover their tracks. They wanted me to finance my own deception. I reached out and traced the edge of my laptop screen, my fingertips resting near the forged signature. I had spent my entire life feeling small inside their corporate shadow. I had absorbed their insults, accepted their transactional love, and believed their carefully constructed narrative of superiority. I had allowed them to dictate the terms of my worth, but looking at the undeniable proof of their desperation, the remaining fragments of that illusion dissolved into dust. They were not titans of industry. They were common criminals wearing expensive suits, dangling over a cliff of their own making. I closed the PDF and downloaded a secured encrypted copy of the entire folder directly to a physical flash drive. I removed the drive from the port and slipped it into the pocket of my jeans. The small piece of metal felt heavier than a brick. I did not cry. I did not feel the urge to scream or throw my palette knife across the room. The familiar heat of shame and inferiority that usually accompanied interactions with my family was gone, replaced by a crystalline, unyielding resolve. I had survived their emotional starvation. I had built a multi-million-dollar career from raw pigment and canvas. I was not going to let them steal the foundation of my future to pave over their crimes. I closed the laptop and picked up my phone. William and Victoria believed they were playing a game of intimidation. They thought they could leverage guilt and traditional hierarchy to force my compliance. They had no idea that the game board had just been flipped. I was no longer the naive artist they could easily manipulate. I held the digital evidence of their fraud. I held the capital they desperately needed to survive. I held all the power. I opened my contact list and pressed the call button for Patricia. The high-powered estate attorney was known for dismantling hostile takeovers with surgical precision. It was time to stop painting canvases and start building a fortress. The drive to downtown Santa Fe took 20 minutes. I kept the windows rolled down, letting the dry desert wind whip through the cabin of my truck. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white, tracing the worn leather seams. The encrypted flash drive sat in the cup holder. It was smaller than a tube of paint, yet it held enough destructive potential to level my family's entire empire. Patricia operated out of a sleek, minimalist suite near the historic plaza. She was a woman who dealt in permanence. Her suits were tailored, her desk was carved from a single slab of polished obsidian, and her reputation was terrifying. We had met at a gallery exhibition a few years prior, bonding over a shared appreciation for structural integrity. She understood the architecture of wealth better than anyone in New Mexico. I walked into her air-conditioned office, the sudden cold raising goosebumps on my arms. The scent of expensive paper and lemon polish hung in the sterile air. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic, earthy smell of my art studio. I sat in the leather chair across from her, placing the small metal drive onto the dark stone surface. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I outlined the events of the past 24 hours in chronological order. The dinner, the phone call, Victoria's sudden request for a bridge loan, the paint-stained blazer. Then I instructed Patricia to open the files I had downloaded from the family server. Patricia plugged the drive into her laptop. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, scanned the digital pages. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic clicking of her mouse. She stopped scrolling when she reached the signature block on the commercial loan agreement. "This is the Taos Trust document," Patricia said, her voice smooth and devoid of judgment. She tapped the screen with a manicured nail. "And this is your signature, authorizing a multi-million-dollar lien against the estate." "I have never seen that document in my life," I replied, keeping my posture rigid. I did not sign it. My father grafted my signature from another file to secure the capital for my sister. Patricia leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. She did not gasp. She did not offer pity. She simply evaluated the variables on the board, calculating the leverage. "If what you are saying is true," she began, measuring her words with surgical precision, "your father and your sister have committed federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. The regional bank in Albuquerque holds a fraudulent note. If this startup defaults, the bank will seize the historic property. When the auditors examine the origination file, the forgery will surface. William is facing a lengthy prison sentence. Victoria will likely join him as a co-conspirator. A cold chill settled over my skin, but I welcomed it. It was the sensation of clarity. They were trapped in a burning building, and I was holding the only bucket of water. We should take this directly to the authorities. Patricia suggested, reaching for the sleek phone on her desk. A federal prosecutor would dismantle their firm by Friday. I shook my head, stopping her hand. No. Patricia raised an eyebrow, a silent demand for an explanation. If we call the police, I explained, William will spin the narrative. He is a master manipulator with deep ties in the local business community. He will hire a public relations firm. He will claim this was a simple administrative error, a family misunderstanding. He will say he always intended to pay the loan back, painting me as a vindictive, unstable artist throwing a tantrum. He might even negotiate a settlement and walk away with a slap on the wrist. I refused to give him the opportunity to control the story. Patricia withdrew her hand from the phone. A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. She recognized the predator waking up inside me. What is your objective, Lyra? I want to build a fortress, I said. I want to secure my payout so they cannot touch a single cent. And then I want to systematically dismantle their leverage. I want them to realize they are ruined on a stage they cannot talk their way out of. Patricia nodded, opening a fresh legal pad. Then we do not use the police. We use the market. We weaponize the very financial system they revere. For the next 3 hours, we mapped out the vulnerabilities of the Robert family. William was drowning in high-interest debt. Victoria was burning through cash. They had no liquid assets left, only the illusion of solvency. First, we build the wall Patricia instructed. I am establishing an irrevocable trust for your recent art sale. The funds from the Madrid buyer will be routed directly into this shielded entity. Your father cannot subpoena it. He cannot claim familial right to it, and he cannot freeze it. The money will legally cease to be yours in a personal capacity, making it impervious to any civil litigation he might attempt. That protects the capital, I noted. What about the offense? Patricia's eyes gleamed with a calculating light. We go on the offensive. We take a portion of your funds and establish an anonymous limited liability company registered in Delaware, a ghost entity. The holding company shields your identity behind layers of corporate privacy laws. Once the entity is capitalized, we use it to execute our trap. She explained the mechanics of the maneuver. William and Victoria were relying on the Albuquerque Bank to keep their secret buried. But banks are simply businesses that buy and sell risk. If a commercial loan is underperforming, the bank will often sell the debt to private investors at a discount to clear their books. We wait until Victoria misses her next payment, Patricia detailed. The moment that loan goes into distress territory, your anonymous company will approach the bank and purchase the debt. You will own the note. You will become their primary creditor. You will hold the lien on the Taos property, and you will hold the proof of their forgery. The elegance of the plan took my breath away. There would be no screaming matches, no emotional pleas. I was going to buy the chains they had forged themselves and lock the doors from the outside. Let us draft the paperwork, I said. Patricia worked with breathtaking speed. She drafted the articles of incorporation, the trust charters, and the privacy shields. She summoned a notary from the hall, verifying my identity and witnessing my genuine signatures. I signed my name 12 times, each stroke of the pen severing another tie to the people who shared my bloodline. When the final document was executed, Patricia reviewed the stack of crisp legal paper. She aligned the edges perfectly, tapping them against the obsidian desk. She picked up her heavy gold fountain pen. She twisted the cap onto the barrel. Click. The sharp, decisive sound echoed through the sterile office. It was the sound of a vault locking. It was the sound of my future being sealed safe from the parasites who sought to drain it. The trust is active, Patricia announced, sliding the protective folder toward me. The anonymous entity will be incorporated by tomorrow morning. You are officially untouchable. I took the folder, the weight of the paper grounding me. I felt a profound sense of peace. The anxiety that had plagued my entire adult life, the constant fear of disappointing the patriarchal structure, vanished. I was no longer playing defense. I was the architect of my own reality. "Just remember," Patricia warned as I stood up to leave, "cornered animals are unpredictable." When William realizes his intimidation tactics are failing, he will pivot. He will try to trap you publicly. He will use your reputation against you. I walked out of the downtown office building and stepped into the blinding New Mexico sunlight. The heat radiated from the pavement, but I felt ice cold. My phone vibrated in my pocket before I even reached my truck. I pulled it out, looking at the screen. It was an email from William's executive assistant. The subject line was marked urgent. I opened the message. It was a formal invitation to a high-profile corporate gala in Albuquerque, hosted by my father's development firm. The event was scheduled for the end of the week. The guest list included every major investor, creditor, and politician in the state. The text of the email dripped with false warmth. William was requesting my presence as the guest of honor, claiming he wanted to publicly celebrate my artistic triumph. I stared at the invitation, Patricia's warning echoing in my ears. "He will try to trap you publicly." William was not inviting me to celebrate. He was inviting me to be a prop. He intended to parade me in front of his anxious creditors to prove he had access to $1 million safety net. He was launching a public relations offensive, spinning a narrative of unity to calm the sharks circling his sinking ship. He thought I was walking into his arena blind and obedient. He had no idea I was bringing the execution order with me. 2 hours after the email arrived, a black town car idled outside my Canyon Road studio. The low rumble of the engine vibrated through the thin window panes. A driver wearing a crisp charcoal suit stepped out onto the dusty gravel. He bypassed the vibrant turquoise door of the neighboring pottery shop and walked straight to my entrance. He knocked twice, holding a thick silver envelope. I wiped a streak of yellow ochre from my palm with a rag and answered the door. The driver handed me the parcel without a word, tipped his hat, and returned to his idling vehicle. I stood in the doorway, feeling the weight of the envelope in my hands. The paper was custom-pressed, heavy enough to double as a weapon. I slid my thumb under the wax seal and extracted the invitation. The printing was executed in raised metallic foil. It announced a formal gala hosted by the Robert Development Group at the most exclusive country club in Albuquerque. The text declared the evening a celebration of regional innovation, honoring the artistic triumph of Lyra Robert. I traced the embossed letters of my name. It looked impressive to an untrained eye, but my entire career was built on observing negative space and subtle proportions. I looked at the top of the cardstock. The dual hosts of the evening were listed in bold typography. My father's commercial real estate firm occupied the left side. The right side featured the sleek, modern crest of Victoria's tech startup. I held the card closer to the natural light streaming through the window. The graphic designer had made a deliberate choice. Victoria's corporate logo was scaled just a fraction larger than my name. It was a microscopic detail, but in my family, nothing was accidental. The hierarchy was literally printed on the page. This was not a celebration of my art. This was a corporate branding exercise designed to tether my sudden liquid wealth to their sinking ships. My phone vibrated in my back pocket. I set the heavy cardstock onto my work table and pulled the device out. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I took a slow breath, modulating my heart rate. I needed to play a very specific role. I cleared my throat, forcing the muscles in my face to relax, and pressed the green icon. "Hello," I said, keeping my tone light and breathless. "Lyra, sweetheart," William's voice boomed through the speaker. His baritone was rich, coated in a thick layer of manufactured warmth. "I wanted to make sure you received the courier. I am holding the invitation right now," I replied. "It is beautiful, Dad. I am just a bit overwhelmed." I could hear the smile stretch across his face through the receiver. He loved when people felt overwhelmed by his gestures. It meant he was in control. "We are so proud of you," William continued, his tone dripping with paternal affection. "I know we had a tense moment at dinner. Your sister and I were just caught off guard by the numbers, but we sat down this morning and realized what a monumental achievement this is. You put Santa Fe on the map. We want to show you off to the world." He was executing the false thaw flawlessly. Manipulators always use this tactic when their initial intimidation fails. They drop the temperature, offer a warm blanket of validation, and wait for their target to fall asleep. During my teenage years, William hosted these corporate galas twice a year. He would force me to wear stiff, uncomfortable dresses and stand silently by the appetizer table while he introduced Victoria to local politicians. Whenever someone asked about me, he would chuckle and tell them I was studying to be a starving artist. Now I was the centerpiece of his entire public relations strategy. "That is very generous of you," I said, injecting just enough hesitation into my voice to sound naive. "But Albuquerque is a long drive, and these events are usually for your investors. I would not want to impose on your business networking." "Nonsense," William countered quickly. A hint of urgency slipped through his warm facade. "This is a family event. We need to project a united front. Besides, there are a few key people attending who are very eager to meet the woman who painted that $1 million masterpiece. Marcus Thorne will be there, and the executive board from the regional bank. They are big patrons of the arts, Lyra. It would be a phenomenal networking opportunity for your future galleries." I stared at the paint-splattered floorboards of my studio. Marcus Thorne was not an art patron. He was a ruthless private equity investor known for liquidating distressed assets. And the executive board from the regional bank were the exact people holding the fraudulent $3.5 million note on the Taos property. William was not inviting me to advance my career. He was parading me in front of his anxious creditors. He needed the bank executives and the private equity sharks to see me standing by his side, smiling and compliant. He was using my physical presence as a visual guarantee that the Robert family had fresh, untethered capital ready to deploy. He believed I was blind to the trap. He thought I was just a desperate daughter starved for his approval, willing to walk into the lion's den the moment he finally tossed me a scrap of validation. "What should I wear?" I asked, playing the part of the anxious, eager child. "Is it black tie?" I heard a muffled sigh of relief on the other end of the line. He had secured the asset. "Your mother has already taken care of that," William said smoothly. "She contacted a stylist in town. They will deliver a gown to your studio tomorrow afternoon. Something elegant. Something that says you belong in this tax bracket. We will send a car for you on Friday at 6. Just bring yourself and that beautiful smile. We will handle the rest." "Thank you, Dad. I will be ready." I hung up the phone. The silence in the studio returned heavy and expectant. I walked over to the wooden easel standing in the center of the room. A blank, stretched canvas rested on the pegs. The white surface reflected the midday sun. I reached out and traced the rough texture of the woven cotton. William wanted a visual prop to pacify his creditors. He wanted a silent daughter draped in a designer gown, nodding obediently while he lied through his teeth. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for, but I was also bringing my own contribution to the gala. If my father wanted to use my artistic triumph to shield his crimes, I needed to understand exactly what narrative he was spinning to the public. I walked back to my desk and opened my laptop. I typed William Robert into the search engine, filtering the results for recent news articles published within the last 48 hours. The screen populated with a dozen links. I clicked the top result. It was a digital copy of a prominent Southwest lifestyle and business magazine. The headline was written in bold, stark lettering. "The Architecture of Success, an exclusive interview with William Robert on building a family dynasty." Below the text was a high-resolution photograph of my father, standing in the lobby of his corporate headquarters. He looked powerful, distinguished, and entirely in control. I scrolled down to the body of the article. The journalist had asked him about the sudden, record-breaking art sale on Canyon Road, noting my relation to his firm. I read William's quoted response, and the cold, clinical resolve in my chest sharpened into something resembling a blade. My father had not just taken credit for my success. He had fabricated an entire history overwriting my years of isolation, poverty, and grueling labor with a fictional story of his own benevolence. He was laying the groundwork to steal the narrative of my life, piece by piece, before an audience of thousands. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the printed lies, realizing that the upcoming gala was no longer just about financial leverage. It was about exposing a thief who was trying to steal my past to finance his future. I scrolled down the digital page of the Southwest Lifestyle magazine. The sleek layout featured a secondary photo of William standing on a golf course, looking like a benevolent patriarch. The journalist had framed him as a visionary, not just in commercial real estate, but in cultivating human potential. I read the direct quote highlighted in a pull-out box near the center of the screen. "Lyra always had a unique vision," William was quoted saying, "but talent requires a solid foundation. I made sure she had the resources she needed. I financed her early studio space off Canyon Road. I bought her first professional canvases. A parent's job is to build a safety net so their child can take creative risks without fear of failure." I stared at the glowing pixels, a safety net. The sheer scale of the fabrication was breathtaking. He was not merely inflating his role, he was inventing an alternate reality. I remembered the winter I signed the lease for this studio. The space had no central heating. I had worked 3 consecutive double shifts at a local diner just to afford the security deposit. I ate rice and beans for a month. When I asked William if I could borrow a space heater from his corporate storage unit, he told me that struggling builds character and hung up the phone. Now he was broadcasting to the entire New Mexico business elite that he was the architect of my career. This was not just vanity, it was a calculated legal strategy. Patricia had warned me about this specific tactic. By establishing a public record of financial support, William was planting seeds. If he ever needed to claim a percentage of my income in court, or if he tried to integrate my liquid assets into his failing trust, he now had published interviews painting him as my primary investor. He was stealing my history to secure his future. I pushed the laptop away and walked over to the deep utility sink in the corner of the room. I turned the brass faucet, letting the warm water run over my hands. I reached into a glass jar and pulled out a handful of old paintbrushes. These were not the expensive sable hairbrushes Elias had gifted me last year for my birthday. These were cheap, synthetic bristles with cracked wooden handles. The blue paint on the wood had chipped away a long time ago. I bought them at a discount craft store when I was 19. They were the only tools I could afford. I rubbed a block of Castile soap into the palm of my hand and gently swirled the bristles into the lather. The water turned a muddy brown, washing away days of dried pigment. I felt the splintered wood press against my skin. I had painted my first 5 murals with these exact brushes. I knew every flaw in their design. I knew how to angle them to hide their imperfections and maximize their stroke. They were worn down, discarded by the corporate world, but they had built an empire. William wanted to tell the world he bought my tools. He wanted to overwrite my late nights, my blistered fingers, my fierce independence. He thought a glossy magazine article could erase the truth. I rinsed the soap from the bristles, watching the water run clear. I laid the brushes flat on a clean linen towel. They were clean, sharp, and ready to work. The gala was 3 days away. I needed to bring a piece of art to the event. William had requested it via his assistant, asking for a centerpiece to stand in the country club lobby. He wanted a visual prop to tie his name to my recent $1 million sale. He expected a pleasant, decorative landscape, something safe, something that matched his corporate aesthetic and made his investors feel comfortable. I walked to the storage rack at the back of the room and pulled out the largest blank canvas I owned. It stood 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide. The woven cotton was taut and expectant. I set it on the heavy wooden easel in the center of the studio. If my father wanted a centerpiece for his masquerade, I would give him one. I did not sketch an outline. I did not plan a polite composition. I opened a large tin of raw charcoal and began to mark the canvas. My strokes were hard and deliberate. The charcoal snapped in my hand, leaving thick, dark lines across the pristine white surface. I channeled every ounce of the cold clarity I felt into my hands. The psychological betrayal of a parent trying to steal your identity is a very specific type of grief. It is not a loud, chaotic sorrow. It is a quiet, suffocating realization that you were never a person to them. You were always a commodity to be bought, sold, or traded for leverage. I picked up my palette knife and a tube of deep crimson oil paint. I layered the red over the charcoal, scraping the pigment across the canvas. The colors mixed, creating a bruised, visceral texture. I added layers of metallic gold, representing the hollow facade of his corporate wealth. Then I dragged thick strokes of black across the gold, shattering the illusion. The painting became a map of the hidden ledger. It was an abstract representation of a foundation crumbling under the weight of its own lies. I worked for 12 hours straight. I did not eat. I did not answer the phone. The physical exertion grounded me. My shoulders burned. My hands ached. But the image emerging on the canvas was undeniable. It was the truth rendered in oil and earth. By the second day, the studio smelled heavily of drying medium and varnish. The painting was finished. It stood in the center of the room, dark and commanding. It was a Trojan horse designed to sit in the middle of William's elegant ballroom. It was the antithesis of everything he stood for. The countdown to the Albuquerque Gala ticked away. The atmosphere in the city felt tense, similar to the air right before a desert thunderstorm. On Thursday afternoon, a courier delivered a large garment bag. I unzipped the nylon cover. Inside hung a floor-length evening gown in a shade of deep emerald green. It was constructed of heavy, expensive silk. My mother had chosen it. It was beautiful, but it felt like a uniform. A costume designed to make me fit seamlessly into their corporate diorama. I left it hanging on the studio door. My anonymous entity was active. The legal trap was set. The Albuquerque bank held the distressed debt, and Patricia was monitoring Victoria's corporate accounts by the hour. We were waiting for the inevitable default. The financial vice was tightening around my father's neck, and he was entirely oblivious. He spent the remainder of the week giving more interviews. He doubled down on his public relations campaign. He went on a local business podcast and discussed the importance of family synergy, hinting that his development group was expanding into high-end cultural investments. He was painting himself into a corner, sealing his own fate with every word he spoke into a microphone. I listened to the podcast while I cleaned my workspace, wiping down tables and sweeping the terracotta floor. His voice sounded so confident. He truly believed he had outsmarted the universe. He thought his forged signature would hold. He thought I was subdued by the promise of a fancy party. The contrast between his public lies and the quiet truth residing in my studio created a vibrating tension. He was bringing a magazine article to a gunfight. I covered the imposing abstract painting with a thick canvas dropcloth, hiding it from view. It was ready to be transported to the country club tomorrow morning. I turned off the overhead lights, leaving only a single desk lamp burning in the corner. The studio grew quiet. The battle lines were drawn. William was relying on his ability to talk his way out of a sinking ship. I was relying on the binding power of contract law. I sat in my armchair, drinking a glass of cold water, letting the silence settle around me. But the silence did not last. Just past 9 o'clock, the heavy oak door of my studio rattled. A key turned in the lock. My landlord was the only other person who possessed a key, but the heavy footsteps echoing in the small entryway belonged to a man wearing expensive leather dress shoes. The door swung open, and William stepped into the dim light. The false warmth he had used on the phone was gone. The benevolent patriarch from the magazine article vanished. He looked exhausted, cornered, and incredibly dangerous. He had come to issue an ultimatum, and he was not going to take no for an answer. William stood in the entryway of my studio. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. He reached out and turned the brass deadbolt, locking us inside. The sharp metallic sound echoed across the terracotta floor tiles. He did not look like the polished corporate patriarch from the magazine cover. His silk tie was pulled loose. His tailored suit jacket was wrinkled along the sleeves. The skin around his eyes looked bruised with deep exhaustion. He stepped away from the door and walked into the pool of light cast by my corner desk lamp. He surveyed the room, his upper lip curling in subtle disgust at the smell of turpentine and raw linseed oil. The warm, affectionate tone he had used on the phone yesterday was gone. The benevolent father mask had dissolved. Only the ruthless extortionist remained. I did not stand up to greet him. I remained seated in my armchair, holding a glass of cold water. I kept my breathing slow and measured. "How did you get a key?" I asked, my voice steady in the quiet room. William walked toward the center of the studio. "I own the building, Lyra. I purchased this property through a shell corporation 3 years ago. Did you genuinely believe a commercial landlord on Canyon Road would rent prime real estate to an unproven painter with zero credit history unless someone guaranteed the lease?" The revelation landed like a stone in my stomach. He had controlled my sanctuary this entire time. He had kept me on an invisible leash, watching me struggle to pay rent to a phantom landlord, knowing the checks were funneling right back into his own accounts. It was a perfect encapsulation of his transactional nature. He monitored my poverty for sport, ensuring I never truly escaped his jurisdiction. He stopped in front of the large wooden easel, holding my hidden canvas. He stared down at me, his posture rigid. "Your sister came to see you earlier this week," William stated. His voice was hard, carrying the commanding cadence of a boardroom dictator. "She asked for a minor financial accommodation. You disrespected her. You disrespected this family." I took a slow sip of water, letting the cold liquid soothe my dry throat. "She asked for $300,000 to bail out a failing tech firm. I declined the investment opportunity. It was not a request." William snapped, taking a heavy step closer. The air in the room grew tight. "You are a member of the Robert family. When the family requires liquidity, you provide it. You do not ask questions. You do not issue rejections. You write the check." He paced in front of the easel, his leather shoes scuffing the floorboards. "The situation has escalated since Victoria visited you. The creditors are circling. The startup is facing a severe cash deficit. I need $800,000 wired to the primary holding account by Monday morning at 8 o'clock. $800,000. He was demanding 2/3 of my entire sale. He wanted to drain my accounts to cover the fraudulent loan he took out against our grandfather's estate. He wanted my life's work to pay for his felony. I set my water glass on the wooden desk. "And what happens if I say no?" William stopped pacing. He looked at me with a cold, hollow expression. It was the kind of look a butcher gives a piece of meat on a scale. "If you refuse to do your duty," he said slowly, "I will destroy your career before the sun sets on Monday." He stepped closer, towering over my chair. "I have spent the last week building a narrative, Lyra. The press believes I am your primary investor. I have spent decades cultivating relationships with every gallery owner, curator, and buyer in Santa Fe. If you withhold those funds, I will call every contact I possess. I will tell them you are mentally unstable. I will tell them you breached a funding contract with my development firm. I will spread rumors that your art is derivative, that you employ ghost painters, that you are a financial liability." He leaned down, placing his hands on the wooden armrests of my chair, trapping me in my seat. I will make sure Elias drops you from his roster. I will make sure no serious collector in this state ever looks at your work again. You will be a pariah. You will go back to sweeping floors and eating rice." I looked past his shoulder. The corner of the canvas dropcloth had slipped off the easel, exposing a small section of my new painting. The bright gold foil and deep crimson oils caught the light from the desk lamp. William shifted his weight. His broad shoulders blocked the bulb. His heavy dark shadow fell directly across the canvas, eclipsing the vibrant colors, plunging my work into total darkness. It was a perfect physical manifestation of his intent. He wanted to stand in front of my light and cast a shadow over everything I had built. He intended to eclipse my success with his greed. I did not flinch. I did not shrink back into the upholstery. I studied the enlarged pores on his face, the broken capillaries near his nose, the desperate panic hiding behind his threats. He was trying to use fear to extract capital. It was the only negotiation strategy he knew. "You would ruin your own daughter to save a failing startup?" I asked quietly. William straightened his posture, adjusting his suit jacket. "Victoria is building a legacy. You are smearing paint on fabric. Do not confuse your sudden luck with actual value. You have until Monday morning." He walked over to the door, placing his hand on the brass knob. He looked back at me, expecting tears. He expected me to beg for forgiveness. He expected me to negotiate a lower sum. "I will address everything at the gala tomorrow," I said. My voice was devoid of emotion. It was a flat, clinical statement. William paused. His eyes narrowed. He searched my face for any sign of defiance, but he found nothing. He saw only a quiet, stoic submission. He believed his intimidation tactics had worked. He believed he had broken my spirit, just as he had done when I was 18 years old. "We will have the wire transfer forms waiting for you in the VIP lounge," William said, a smug satisfaction returning to his tone. "Wear the green dress your mother picked out. Do not embarrass us." He opened the door and walked out into the night, leaving the lock unlatched. The heavy wooden door drifted shut on its hinges. The studio was quiet again. I remained in the chair for a long time. The extortion attempt was the final confirmation I needed. Any lingering trace of familial guilt vanished from my conscience. My father had just explicitly promised to destroy my livelihood if I did not finance his fraud. He had crossed the point of no return. I stood up and walked over to the hidden canvas. I pulled the dropcloth away entirely. The desk lamp illuminated the stark, bruised texture of the painting. The dark charcoal lines cutting through the gold foil looked like iron bars. The piece was an honest reflection of my family. William thought he held all the cards. He thought his public relations campaign and his industry connections gave him ultimate authority. He did not know about the anonymous holding company registered in Delaware. He did not know Patricia had spent the afternoon tracking the Albuquerque bank records. He did not know that Victoria had officially missed her final grace period payment at 5 o'clock today. The tech startup was now formally in default. The commercial loan was distressed. My legal trap was primed and ready to snap shut. I reached into my pocket and touched the cold metal of my phone. I needed to send one message to Patricia before I went to sleep. The instructions were simple. Execute the purchase order. By the time William put on his tuxedo tomorrow evening, he would no longer own the debt. He would no longer control the Taos property. He would be entirely at my mercy, standing on a stage of his own making, surrounded by the very creditors he was trying to deceive. I walked over to the studio door and turned the deadbolt, locking the world out. The countdown to the Albuquerque Gala had officially reached its final hours. I arrived at the downtown law firm before the sun had fully breached the horizon. The streets of Santa Fe were empty, bathed in the pale violet light of early dawn. I parked my truck in the underground garage and took the private elevator straight to the top floor. Patricia was already waiting in her obsidian-paneled office. 2 cups of black coffee steamed on her desk, sitting next to a thick stack of printed financial portfolios. She did not look tired. She looked like a predator anticipating a meal. The tech startup missed the midnight deadline, Patricia stated, skipping the morning pleasantries. Victoria's company is officially in default. The Albuquerque lending institution automatically classified the $3.5 million note as a non-performing asset. I sat in the leather chair opposite her, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic mug. Will they sell the paper to us so quickly? Regional banks abhor carrying distressed commercial debt into a new fiscal quarter, the attorney explained, opening her sleek laptop. It damages their liquidity ratios and invites federal regulatory scrutiny. They prefer to quietly assign troubled notes to private equity buyers, especially when the collateral involves a complex family trust. Foreclosing on historic Adobe estates generates terrible local press in this state. Our anonymous Delaware holding company offered them a clean, immediate exit. I watched her manicured fingers glide across the keyboard, and William has no idea. Your father assumes the bank will grant a standard 30-day cure period before initiating collection procedures, Patricia replied, her eyes locked on the glowing screen. He believes he has time to bully you into wiring the ransom money on Monday. He is operating under the assumption that the original lender still controls the chessboard. She paused, navigating to a secure wire transfer portal. He does not realize the board has already been purchased. The digital architecture we had constructed the previous afternoon was primed. My gallery funds rested safely inside the shielded, irrevocable trust. The Delaware entity was fully capitalized and legally insulated, creating an impenetrable wall around my identity. Patricia had spent the entire night negotiating the debt assignment with the bank's asset management division, representing my ghost corporation as a cash-rich investment group looking to acquire collateralized regional debt. I am initiating the transfer sequence, Patricia announced. Once the clearinghouse verifies the liquid funds, the bank will electronically assign the promissory note and the deed of trust directly to your company. I nodded, remaining silent. The atmosphere in the room was dense with anticipation. Last night, William had invaded my personal sanctuary. He had leaned over my chair, using his physical size and parental authority to threaten my livelihood. He had promised to destroy my reputation in the art community if I did not submit to his extortion. He relied on noise intimidation and the primitive tactics of a playground bully. This room represented the exact opposite of his methodology. There was no shouting. There were no physical threats. There was only the terrifying silent power of contract law and capitalized leverage correctly applied. We waited in the quiet office, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioning vents. The seconds ticked by, measuring the distance between my past as a marginalized victim and my future as the sovereign authority over my family's legacy. Then the sound broke the silence. King! It was a quiet, sterile chime from Patricia's laptop speakers. A small notification bubble materialized in the upper right corner of her monitor. Patricia took a slow sip of her coffee. She clicked the notification, opening a newly delivered encrypted document. She scanned the digital text, verifying the legal seals and the tracking numbers. A sharp, satisfied smile altered her severe features. She rotated the laptop across the dark stone desk, turning the screen toward me. The transaction is legally binding and irrevocable, she said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a judge rendering a final verdict. The wire transfer cleared. The regional bank has relinquished all claims. The assignment of debt is officially recorded in the state registry. I leaned forward, reading the formal header of the document. It was a transfer of lien. What exactly does this mean? I asked, wanting to hear the reality spoken aloud. It means you are the bank, Patricia replied, resting her hands flat on the desk. You are Victoria's primary secured creditor. Your anonymous corporation owns the $3.5 million loan. Because the loan is in default, you possess the immediate right to demand full repayment of the principal balance. I traced the edge of the monitor. and the collateral. You hold the exclusive lien on the Taos Heritage Trust property, she confirmed. If your sister cannot produce the cash, you possess the legal authority to seize the historic estate. Furthermore, you now possess the original loan origination file. That file contains the digital forgery of your signature. The trap was locked. It was a masterpiece of forensic engineering. William had built a house of cards on a foundation of fraud, and I had just purchased the wind. By the time I put on my evening gown for the corporate gala tonight, I would literally own my family's financial future. Every threat my father had made, every condescending lecture he had delivered, was now rendered entirely obsolete. Print the default notices I instructed standing up from the leather chair. Print the assignment of debt. Print the forged signature page. Put them in a leather portfolio. Patricia raised an eyebrow, appreciating the tactical shift. You are bringing the execution orders to the party. He wants to use my physical presence to pacify his investors, I said, a cold resolve settling deep in my chest. I am going to deliver the reality he has been trying to hide. Have the documents delivered to my studio by noon. I left the law firm and drove back to Canyon Road. The New Mexico sun was climbing high, baking the terracotta roofs and drying the desert air. My mind was perfectly clear. The anxiety that had gripped me during the dinner at La Tierra was erased. I was no longer a passenger in their chaotic narrative. I was the author of the final chapter. When I entered my studio, the heavy green silk dress hung on the back of the oak door, catching the midday light. My mother had selected it. She wanted me to look wealthy, compliant, and deeply integrated into their corporate aesthetic. It was a costume designed for a supporting character. I walked over and unzipped the garment bag. I ran my calloused, paint-stained fingers over the delicate fabric. I would wear the dress. I would play the part of the dutiful daughter, right up until the moment I stepped onto the stage. The afternoon passed in a state of hyper-focused preparation. A specialized art transport courier arrived at 2 o'clock. They carefully wrapped my newly finished abstract canvas in protective foam and loaded it into a climate-controlled van, driving it south toward the country club in Albuquerque. The painting was the Trojan horse, hiding the bruised, violent truth of our family dynamic beneath layers of gold foil and crimson oil. At 4 o'clock, a messenger from Patricia's office delivered a sleek black leather portfolio. It contained the printed legal documents, notarized and stamped with the state seal. I placed the portfolio on my desk, right next to my discarded charcoal sticks. At 5 o'clock, I began to get ready. I washed my hair, scrubbing the lingering scent of turpentine from my skin. I applied my makeup with the same precise, measured strokes I used on a canvas, highlighting the sharp angles of my jawline. I stepped into the emerald gown. The heavy silk fell perfectly around my frame, acting as a luxurious suit of armor. I clasped a simple silver necklace around my throat, rejecting the ostentatious jewelry my sister usually wore. I looked at my reflection in the tall studio mirror. The woman staring back at me did not look like a struggling artist begging for scraps of validation. She looked like an apex predator disguised in evening wear. At exactly 6 o'clock, the low rumble of a luxury engine vibrated through the floorboards. The black town car had arrived to collect me. I picked up the leather portfolio, its weight a comforting reminder of my absolute jurisdiction over the impending conflict. I turned off the studio lights, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I walked out into the warm evening air, stepping into the back of the waiting vehicle, ready to burn my father's empire to the ground. The town car glided up the sweeping circular driveway of the Albuquerque Country Club, tires crunching softly against the crushed white gravel. I looked out the tinted window. The sprawling architecture mirrored a modern palace, all sharp glass angles and polished sandstone, glowing under the harsh glare of imported security floodlights. Valets in crisp white jackets rushed to open doors for arriving guests. while a small cluster of local reporters gathered near the velvet ropes, cameras flashing like erratic lightning. I stepped out of the vehicle, the heavy emerald silk of my gown brushing against the pavement. The evening air carried the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the faint metallic tang of ozone. I held the black leather portfolio securely against my side. It felt like an anchor tethering me to reality amidst a sea of fabricated glamour. A uniformed attendant guided me through the grand foyer and into the main ballroom. The scale of the event was designed to intimidate. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting fractured light over hundreds of guests. The room was packed with the financial elite of New Mexico. I recognized private equity partners, regional politicians, and prominent real estate brokers. They held fluted champagne glasses, exchanging shallow pleasantries and calculated smiles. The atmosphere was suffocatingly pretentious, a theater of status, where everyone was desperate to prove their net worth. I stood near the entrance, surveying the crowd. I was not looking for friends. I was identifying the targets. I spotted the executive board members from the regional lending institution huddled near the bar. They were the very men who had authorized the fraudulent $3.5 million note. Tonight, they thought they were attending a celebration of William's continued success. They had no idea they were sharing a room with the ghost corporation that just bought their toxic debt. Before I could move further into the room, a heavy hand clamped down on my elbow. "Lyra," my father announced, his voice booming over the string quartet playing in the corner. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into my arm just enough to assert physical control without causing a scene. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, projecting the image of a fearless titan of industry. The exhaustion I had witnessed in my studio last night was masterfully hidden beneath a fresh shave and practiced bravado. He did not wait for me to speak. He pulled me forward, parading me through the dense crowd like a newly acquired trophy. "Look who finally decided to join us," William declared, steering me directly toward the cluster of bank executives. "Gentlemen, I want to introduce my daughter, the artist of the hour." The men turned their eyes, appraising my dress, my posture, and my perceived utility. They offered polite, measured greetings. "This is Richard and Thomas from the Commercial Underwriting Division," William said, gesturing to the men. "They have been vital partners in expanding our development portfolio. And Lyra is bringing a fresh wave of capital into the family ecosystem. She is our newest investor." The implication hung heavily in the air. William was explicitly telling his anxious creditors that my million-dollar art sale was acting as a direct infusion of liquidity for his sinking enterprises. He was using my physical presence to underwrite his lies. He expected me to nod in agreement, to play the role of the loyal, submissive child, funding the family legacy. I looked at Richard and Thomas. I offered them a radiant, practiced smile. "It is a pleasure to meet the men who manage my father's obligations," I said, keeping my tone perfectly pleasant. William beamed, tightening his grip on my elbow. He interpreted my polite response as total capitulation. "See, gentlemen?" he chuckled, patting my shoulder. "Family synergy. We pool our resources. The tech startup is entering a very lucrative phase, and Lyra here understands the value of backing a winning horse." The dramatic irony was so thick, it practically choked me. I stood surrounded by men my father was actively defrauding, holding the forensic proof of his felony inside the leather portfolio tucked under my arm. I nodded along to his fabricated narrative, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. The tension required to maintain this pleasant facade was exhilarating. I was walking on a wire, and the ground below was littered with their impending ruin. William excused us, eager to drag me toward another group of potential marks. As he pulled me past the central buffet station, my gaze caught on the primary decorative feature of the room. A towering, elaborate ice sculpture sat in the middle of a long banquet table. It was carved into the shape of Victoria's tech company logo. It was intended to project strength and permanence. But the ballroom was crowded, and the heat generated by hundreds of bodies was taking a toll. The sharp edges of the carved ice were already softening. A steady stream of cold water dripped down the sides of the sculpture, pooling on the pristine white tablecloth. The fabric was soaked, the dark water stain spreading outward like a slow hemorrhage. It was a flawless metaphor for their delusion of control. They could dress up their failing empire in crystal and silk, but the foundation was melting right in front of them. Just as I pulled my elbow free from my father's grasp, claiming I needed a glass of water, Victoria intercepted me. She wore a stunning silver evening gown, having discarded the paint-ruined blazer from yesterday. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She carried a champagne flute, her posture radiating an unearned smugness. She believed the extortion had worked. She believed I was here to write the check. "You clean up well," Victoria noted, her eyes scanning my emerald dress. "I am glad you decided to be a team player, Lyra. It shows maturity." "Thank you, Victoria," I replied, maintaining my serene expression. "A reporter from the Albuquerque Business Journal is floating around the VIP section," she continued, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He wants a quote about the integration of your art funds into my startup. When he approaches you, I need you to stick to the script." She reached out, attempting to adjust the silver necklace at my throat, a patronizing gesture designed to establish dominance. "Tell him you believe in the disruptive potential of my software," Victoria dictated, pulling her hand back. "Tell him the Robert family always reinvests in internal innovation. Do not mention the Canyon Road studio. We want the focus on the tech sector, not bohemian crafts. Understand?" I looked at her, observing the frantic desperation masquerading as confidence. She was trying to script my own voice, demanding I erase my identity to prop up her failing illusion. She thought she was directing a play, unaware that the theater was scheduled for demolition. "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of friction. "I will make sure the press hears exactly how the Robert family handles their investments." Victoria smiled, taking a sip of champagne, completely satisfied by my apparent obedience. "Good. Just follow my lead tonight and we will get through this." The ballroom lights dimmed slightly, signaling a transition in the evening's schedule. A spotlight illuminated a small wooden stage erected at the far end of the room. The string quartet stopped playing, replaced by the low hum of an amplified microphone. William detached himself from a group of local politicians and walked purposefully toward the stage stairs. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket, projecting the aura of a conquering hero preparing to address his loyal subjects. The crowd began to gravitate toward the front of the room, holding their drinks, waiting for the keynote address. Victoria nudged my shoulder. "It is time," she whispered, her eyes fixed on our father. "Come to the front row. He is going to call us up." I adjusted my grip on the black leather portfolio. The slow burn of the evening had reached its threshold. The false environment, the suffocating pretension, the calculated lies spun by my father and sister were about to collide with the uncompromising reality of contract law. I followed Victoria through the parting crowd, keeping my steps measured and calm, ready to claim the stage. The ballroom lights shifted, pulling focus from the scattered banquet tables toward the elevated wooden stage. The ambient chatter of 300 guests dissolved into a low, expectant murmur. William reached the center of the platform. He stood, bathed in a stark white spotlight, adjusting the lapels of his custom tuxedo. He tapped the head of the microphone twice. The dull thud reverberated through the ceiling speakers, commanding total silence from the room. He looked out over the sea of investors, politicians, and creditors. He possessed an uncanny ability to scan a crowd and make every individual feel like they were the sole recipient of his attention. It was a predator's trick designed to mesmerize the prey before the jaws snapped shut. "Welcome, William," began his baritone voice, smooth and resonant. He did not read from a prepared script. He relied on his natural charisma, the same charm he used to secure zoning permits and manipulate local tax boards. "I look around this room tonight and I see the foundation of New Mexico. I see visionaries. I see partners who understand that building a lasting legacy requires more than just capital. It requires unwavering family values. It requires smart investments. And most importantly, it requires corporate synergy. I stood in the front row, wedged between Victoria and the regional bank executives. The smell of Victoria's expensive floral perfume mixed with the stale odor of spilled champagne. I watched my father pace the width of the small stage, projecting the illusion of invincible wealth. My father continued his monologue, weaving a fabricated narrative about our family history. He spoke about my grandfather Thomas, framing the old rancher as a pioneer of commercial enterprise. It was a staggering distortion of reality. Thomas despised corporate developers. He spent his life preserving the raw beauty of the desert, protecting the Taos property from men exactly like William. Yet here was William standing under a crystal chandelier, using a dead man's integrity to launder his own reputation. "We live in a volatile market," William declared, leaning closer to the microphone stand. "The economy shifts, industries evolve. But the Robert Development Group survives because we diversify. We recognize potential. We nurture it." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the cluster of banking executives standing mere inches away from me. He offered them a knowing, conspiratorial nod. "My eldest daughter, Victoria, represents the future of our technological investments," William announced, extending his hand toward her. Victoria stood taller, basking in the public validation. She offered the crowd a practiced, radiant smile. She played the role of the successful tech visionary flawlessly, betraying zero signs of the crushing debt threatening to bury her. Her software firm is on the verge of a historic expansion. William lied, his voice echoing off the adobe walls. But scaling operations requires strategic capitalization. It requires a unified front. We do not look for outside bailouts when we want to grow. We look inward. We rely on the strength of our own internal portfolio. The transition was seamless. He was laying the groundwork for the theft. He was preparing to hijack my life's work and present it as his own financial strategy. "Which brings me to the true purpose of tonight's gathering," William said, dropping his tone to a warm, intimate register. "For years, I have fostered the creative talents of my youngest daughter, Lyra. I provided her with her first studio space. I invested in her early canvases when nobody else saw her potential. I always believed that true wealth is measured by our dedication to the arts." My stomach tightened, but I kept my breathing slow and even. He was delivering the lines he had rehearsed for the magazine interview. He was erasing my years of poverty isolation and grueling labor, replacing my history with a fairy tale of his own benevolence. And this week, that paternal investment yielded an extraordinary return. William declared, his voice rising in volume, building toward the crescendo. A prominent international collector purchased Lyra's latest architectural mural. A single piece of art, ladies and gentlemen, sold for $1.2 million. A collective murmur of awe rippled through the ballroom. Heads turned, eyes darted through the crowd, searching for me. The sheer size of the number carried a gravitational pull. "But this is not just a personal victory for Lyra," William shouted over the rising noise, gripping the microphone stand. "It is a victory for our entire corporate ecosystem. Because in the Robert family, we operate as a single, synergistic entity." He stepped right up to the edge of the wooden stage, looking directly into the eyes of the regional bank executives. "I am proud to announce tonight that Lyra's $1.2 million art sale is being officially integrated into the family trust." William proclaimed, delivering the final, fatal lie. Those funds will be deployed on Monday morning to propel Victoria's technology firm to unprecedented new heights. We are self-funding our own expansion. We are securing our own legacy. The ballroom erupted into applause. The sound was deafening. I watched Richard and Thomas, the commercial underwriters, exchange a look of profound relief. The tension melted from their shoulders. They believed their toxic loan was saved. They believed the Robert family possessed the liquid capital to cure the impending default. They clapped enthusiastically, celebrating the illusion of immense wealth, entirely unaware that the woman standing next to them already owned the very debt they were trying to recover. William stood in the spotlight, soaking in the adulation. He looked like a conqueror. He had successfully manipulated the press, pacified his creditors, and publicly committed my assets without a single shred of legal consent. He had trapped me in front of 300 influential witnesses. He expected the sheer weight of social pressure to crush any resistance I might offer. He raised his hand, signaling for the applause to die down. "Please," William said, gesturing grandly toward the front row, "I want you all to hear from the artist herself. Lyra, come join your father on stage." The spotlight shifted, sweeping across the floor and landing directly on me. The bright, hot beam illuminated the heavy emerald silk of my gown. Hundreds of faces turned in my direction, their eyes shining with expectation. Victoria leaned close to my ear. Her breath smelled of stale champagne. "Smile," she hissed, her voice barely a whisper beneath the renewed applause. "Get up there and nod. Do not ruin this." I did not look at her. I did not fix my hair or smooth my dress. I stepped forward, stepping out of the shadows and into the harsh glare of the spotlight. I held the black leather portfolio in my left hand. It contained the assignment of debt, the default notices, and the forensic proof of their federal wire fraud. It was a small, unassuming object, but it held the destructive force of a localized earthquake. I walked toward the wooden stairs leading up to the platform. My pace was deliberate, measured, and unhurried. The room was watching my every movement, expecting a shy, grateful daughter to climb the steps and embrace her generous patriarch. I reached the base of the stairs. The wooden planks groaned softly beneath my heels. William walked to the edge of the platform to meet me. He leaned down, extending his large hand. His face carried a broad, camera-ready smile designed for the local press photographers standing near the buffet tables. I raised my right arm, offering him my hand. The moment his skin made contact with mine, the benevolent facade fractured. He did not hold my palm. He slid his fingers down and wrapped his large hand around my bare wrist. His grip was punishing. He squeezed the delicate bones of my wrist with terrifying force, his fingers digging into my pulse point. It was a fraction too tight, an invisible, agonizing threat delivered in plain sight. He was using physical pain to communicate a very clear message. He was in control. If I deviated from his script, if I embarrassed him in front of his creditors, he would make good on his promise to destroy my life. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I kept my face perfectly serene, masking the sharp sting radiating up my forearm. William hauled me up the remaining wooden stairs, using my trapped wrist to dictate my balance. He pulled me close to his side, wrapping his other arm heavily around my shoulders, locking me into place in front of the microphone. The audience cheered louder, captivated by the touching display of family unity. They saw a loving father supporting his talented child. They did not see the bruises forming under his grip. They did not feel the cold, rigid tension vibrating between our bodies. We stood together in the center of the blinding white spotlight. The trap was set. The audience was captive. The illusion of his corporate empire was sitting at its absolute peak, inflated to the point of bursting. William leaned toward the microphone, ready to hand me the floor, fully expecting me to surrender my future to save his pride. He had no idea I had brought the needle. William released my wrist, stepping back just enough to give me access to the microphone. The sudden absence of his crushing grip sent a rush of cold air over my bruised skin. My fingers tingled as circulation returned, but I kept my hand perfectly steady. I placed my right hand on the cool metal shaft of the microphone stand. I held the black leather portfolio securely against my hip with my left arm, feeling the stiff edges of the legal documents pressing through the material. The ballroom was completely silent. 300 influential guests held their breath, waiting for the heartwarming conclusion to the Robert family narrative. They expected a tearful expression of gratitude. They expected a naive daughter to validate the illusion my father had just spent 15 minutes constructing. The heat from the overhead stage lights beat down on my shoulders, warming the heavy emerald silk of my gown. I leaned into the microphone. "Thank you, William," I said. My voice resonated through the massive ceiling speakers. It did not shake. It was cold, clear, and stripped of any familial warmth. The use of his first name, rather than calling him Dad, sent an immediate, almost imperceptible ripple of confusion through the front rows. William maintained his broad, camera-ready smile, but his eyes narrowed instantly. He shifted his weight in his custom tuxedo, sensing a slight deviation from his approved script, but he remained frozen in the bright spotlight, unwilling to break his benevolent patriarch character in front of the local press. I looked out over the crowd, bypassing the regional politicians and focusing directly on the banking executives standing near the edge of the stage. "My father tells a very compelling story," I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. "He speaks about synergy. He speaks about a unified family ecosystem. He just told all of you that he nurtured my creative talents, financed my early studio space, and provided a safety net for my career." I paused, letting the silence stretch across the enormous room. I wanted the heavy weight of his fabricated history to settle over the audience before I dismantled it. I looked at the ice sculpture in the center of the room, still melting and dripping dark water onto the pristine tablecloth. "That is a fascinating narrative," I said, maintaining a level conversational cadence. "But it is entirely fictional." The collective silence in the ballroom transformed into something heavy and dangerous. The air grew thick. A few guests in the back rows shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the rustle of expensive fabric amplifying in the quiet space. The reporters near the buffet tables suddenly raised their cameras, sensing a drastic shift in the atmospheric pressure. William let out a short, forced chuckle. He took a half-step toward me, intending to play off my statement as a bout of stage fright or artistic eccentricity. "What Lyra means," William interrupted, leaning his upper body toward the microphone, "is that artists always feel like they are struggling alone in the beginning. It is part of the creative process." I did not step aside. I held my ground, keeping my mouth close to the audio receiver, cutting him off before he could regain control of the room. "What I mean," I stated, projecting my voice over his nervous laughter, "is that William Robert cut off my college funding a decade ago because he told me fine art was a poor investment. He did not buy my canvases. He did not finance my studio. I spent 7 years working double shifts at local diners to afford unheated garages off Canyon Road. I mixed my own pigments because I could not afford to buy them. 3 nights ago, at a private dinner in Santa Fe, he pointed a silver fork at me and told me to stop playing artist and get a real job." The illusion cracked. The pristine corporate diorama my father had built shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The crowd stared in stunned disbelief. The commercial underwriters, Richard and Thomas, exchanged alarmed glances. Their comfortable, relaxed postures vanished. Victoria, standing in the front row in her silver evening gown, went completely rigid. Her face drained of all color, matching the pale sandstone walls of the country club. She clutched her champagne flute so tightly, her knuckles turned white. I turned my head slightly, looking directly at my father. The spotlight illuminated the sheer panic flaring in his eyes. He was suffocating in the open air. The benevolent mask was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, cornered desperation of a man watching his leverage evaporate in real time. So when my gallery director called me to confirm the sale of my mural for $1.2 million, I continued turning my attention back to the silent crowd. My family was not celebrating a triumph. They were calculating a bailout. A low murmur erupted from the back of the room. The whispers spread like a virus, moving rapidly through the audience of private equity investors and real estate brokers. "Lyra, that is enough," William hissed through clenched teeth. His voice was low, intended only for my ears, but the sensitive microphone picked up the sharp, threatening hiss of his words, broadcasting his barely contained anger to the entire room. I ignored him. I tightened my grip on the metal stand. I had endured 28 years of his condescension and emotional starvation. I was not going to let him silence me now. "My father just announced to all of you that my earnings will be integrated into the family trust to propel Victoria's tech startup," I said, projecting my voice over the rising murmurs. "He told you we are self-funding our own expansion." That was his second lie of the evening. I took a deep breath, preparing to drop the first forensic bombshell. "I will not be investing a single dollar of my art sales into Victoria's company," I declared. The words landed with the concussive force of a physical explosion. "The tech startup is not experiencing a lucrative expansion." I continued driving the nail deeper into the coffin. "It is a distressed, failing entity drowning in highly leveraged debt. The servers are barely running. The company is days away from missing payroll. There is no family synergy. There is no internal safety net. My father brought me here tonight to use my reputation as a visual prop to pacify his anxious creditors." The ballroom erupted into chaos. The polite, hushed murmurs transformed into loud, overlapping conversations. The reporters at the back of the room began snapping photographs in rapid succession, the bright flashes illuminating the panic spreading across the faces of the corporate guests. William lunged forward. His corporate composure completely disintegrated. He abandoned the illusion of the loving father and reverted to the aggressive extortionist who had invaded my studio the previous night. He reached out with both hands, desperate to tear the microphone away from me, desperate to sever the audio feed and stop the bleeding. He grabbed the metal shaft of the microphone stand, his fingers clawing at my hand. I anticipated the physical escalation. As his heavy hands closed around the metal, I instantly let go and stepped backward, moving quickly out of his reach. William yanked the stand toward his chest with excessive force. The sudden, violent movement dragged the heavy iron base across the wooden stage. The microphone tilted downward, passing directly in front of the primary stage monitor speaker, resting on the floorboards. A sharp, high-pitched feedback whine sliced through the ballroom. The sound was deafening, a piercing electronic shriek that forced several guests in the front rows to cover their ears in pain. It was the auditory equivalent of William's internal panic, a loud, ugly noise exposing the total loss of his structural control. The audio technicians scrambled at the soundboard in the back of the room, frantically pulling down the master volume sliders. The feedback whine died abruptly, leaving behind a ringing, stunned silence. William stood in the center of the stage, clutching the microphone stand. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving beneath his ruined tuxedo. He looked down at the crowd, attempting to formulate a response, attempting to weave a new lie to cover the unfolding disaster. But it was far too late. The power dynamic had fundamentally shifted in front of 300 influential witnesses. The investors in the room realized the promised safety net did not exist. The private equity sharks smelled blood in the water. The regional bank executives stared at William with cold, unforgiving calculation, recognizing that the collateral backing their massive commercial loan was resting on a foundation of deceit. Victoria stood frozen in the front row. The smug entitlement she had worn like a crown all evening was completely erased. She looked small, fragile, and entirely exposed. Her illusion of corporate success was publicly demolished. Her status revoked by the very sister she had mocked. I stood near the edge of the stage, safely out of my father's reach. I was breathing evenly. My heart was not racing. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. I had shattered their facade, correcting the historical record for everyone to hear, but the execution was only half complete. They were exposed, but they still believed the Albuquerque bank held the keys to their survival. They still believed they could negotiate a cure period for their default. I looked down at the black leather portfolio resting against my hip. I flipped the brass clasp open. The crowd watched me, their attention completely hijacked by the drama. William stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and genuine terror. He realized he had pushed me too far, but he had no idea how deep the chasm beneath his feet truly went. I reached into the portfolio, sliding my fingers across the crisp, notarized legal documents Patricia had prepared for me. It was time to stop correcting the narrative and start enforcing the law. I slid my hand inside the black leather portfolio. The smooth interior lining felt cool against my fingertips, a stark contrast to the stifling heat generated by the overhead stage lamps. William stood paralyzed near the center of the wooden platform. He was still clutching the microphone stand like a shipwreck survivor holding a piece of floating debris. The ballroom remained trapped in a breathless vacuum. 300 guests stared at us in total silence, the atmosphere charged with electric anticipation. I pulled a thick stack of printed parchment from the folder. The bright stage lights illuminated the state notary seals stamped across the bottom of the pages. The fresh scent of toner ink drifted up from the legal documents, carrying the sterile, undeniable aroma of empirical truth. It was the perfect antidote to the emotional fiction my father had just peddled to the crowd. I turned away from William and faced the front row. Richard and Thomas, the commercial underwriters from the Albuquerque Lending Institution, stood rigid. Their crystal champagne flutes were lowered. Their eyes were locked on the papers in my hand. They were calculating their institutional exposure in real time, sensing a catastrophic failure in their risk management protocols. My voice did not need amplification. The room was so incredibly quiet that every syllable carried effortlessly to the back walls. Your underwriting division classifies non-performing assets at midnight, I said, addressing the two bankers directly. Victoria failed to meet her final cure period deadline yesterday evening. Her tech startup officially defaulted on the $3.5 million commercial loan. Richard blinked repeatedly, his professional composure fracturing. He opened his mouth to respond, perhaps intending to cite client confidentiality, but the sheer gravity of the situation kept him silent. He knew I possessed insider knowledge that could only originate from the highest levels of his organization. Regional lenders despise carrying distressed notes into a new fiscal quarter. I continued keeping my tone clinical and detached. They prefer to assign troubled obligations to private equity firms. It cleans their ledgers and prevents painful regulatory audits. This morning, your asset management team negotiated a swift exit strategy. They sold the troubled note to an anonymous holding company registered in Delaware. I stepped closer to the edge of the platform, looking down at the bewildered faces. I am the sole proprietor of that holding company. I utilized the proceeds from my recent art sale to capitalize the entity. I purchased the debt in its entirety. The revelation cascaded through the ballroom like a physical wave. The pieces of the puzzle aligned for every financial expert in the crowd. They recognized the strategic brilliance of the maneuver. I had not merely defended my wealth from a parasitic family. I had weaponized my capital. Victoria gasped. The sound was sharp and fragile, similar to the noise of stepping on thin winter ice. She swayed in her silver evening gown, her equilibrium failing. She reached out and grabbed the edge of the front row banquet table to keep from collapsing onto the carpet. Her gaze darted frantically toward William, seeking the protective patriarch who always fixed her mistakes. But William offered no salvation. He was suffocating under the weight of his own dismantled hubris. By purchasing the debt, I explained, lowering my gaze to meet my sister's panicked eyes, I am now your primary secured creditor. I own the promissory note. I own the exclusive right to demand immediate repayment of the principal balance. And more importantly, I control the collateral securing the loan. The word collateral sent a visible, violent shudder through William. His broad shoulders slumped forward. The bespoke tuxedo suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his deflating frame. I shifted my attention back to the bank executives. The underwriters were sweating profusely. They sensed the impending legal disaster rapidly approaching their department. When my father originated this loan 2 years ago, I stated he pledged the Taos Heritage Trust property as security. It is a historic estate meant to remain untouched for the grandchildren. A lien of that magnitude requires the unanimous notarized consent of every adult beneficiary. I raised the stack of legal documents higher, displaying the printed pages to the stunned audience. The local press corps at the back of the room realized the magnitude of the story. Camera shutters began clicking in rapid succession, the bright flashes illuminating the horror spreading across the faces of the corporate guests. Tomorrow's headlines were changing right in front of them. My father presented your institution with a signed authorization form, I continued. He provided a document bearing my signature, granting explicit permission to leverage the estate. But I never signed that paper. I never sat in a room with a notary. My father digitally grafted my signature from an old tax return and attached it to the commercial lending agreement. He committed federal wire fraud to secure capital for his favored daughter. The oxygen in the ballroom vanished entirely. The social elite of New Mexico stopped breathing. The accusation of a federal felony delivered with such calm precision paralyzed the crowd. Richard and Thomas physically stepped backward. They retreated from the stage as if the wooden platform had spontaneously caught fire. Their lending institution was holding a fraudulent note. They were exposed to severe regulatory penalties and criminal investigations. The men they had championed moments ago were now radioactive liabilities they needed to abandon immediately. William opened his mouth. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. The master manipulator was stripped of his voice. He had spent decades talking his way out of tight corners, utilizing charm and intimidation to bend reality to his will. But charisma cannot alter a notarized chain of title. Arrogance cannot rewrite a recorded lien. I turned my back on the murmuring crowd and walked toward my father. My emerald silk gown swept across the floorboards. The soft rustle of the fabric accompanied the steady click of my heels. I stopped less than 2 feet away from him. I could smell the stale perspiration soaking into the collar of his expensive dress shirt. His eyes were wide, darting wildly as he searched for an escape route that simply did not exist. He looked incredibly small. The terrifying giant who had haunted my childhood was nothing more than a desperate man caught in a snare of his own design. I held out the stack of documents. "These are the formal notices of default," I said softly, ensuring only he could hear the final judgment over the rising din of the ballroom. "These are the foreclosure initiation filings for the Taos property. You do not have 30 days to cure this error. You do not have a grace period. I am calling the note due immediately." He stared at the papers. He refused to raise his hands. Taking the documents meant accepting his ruin. It meant acknowledging that the daughter he discarded had engineered his total destruction. I did not wait for his compliance. I stepped into his personal space. I pressed the thick stack of legal parchment directly against the center of his chest. The loud, heavy rustle of the stiff paper echoed over the silent stage. The sound was sharp and unforgiving. It was the physical manifestation of the invoice he had finally earned. "Take them, William," I instructed. His arms moved with jerky, robotic hesitation. He brought his hands up, his fingers closing weakly around the edges of the default notices. As soon as he secured his grip, I released the paper and stepped away. The transfer of power was absolute. I looked out at the ballroom. The private equity investors were already turning their backs, moving swiftly toward the exit doors. They had zero interest in associating with a developer facing federal indictment. The local politicians whispered urgently to their aides, orchestrating immediate public relations distancing strategies. The glamorous facade of the country club melted away, leaving only the cold, pragmatic reality of financial survival. Victoria remained anchored to the banquet table. Tears ruined her immaculate makeup, drawing dark streaks down her pale cheeks. She stared at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of her former corporate peers. The vice president title was useless. Her startup was dead. Her social standing was eradicated. William stood frozen in the spotlight. He held the default notices against his chest, staring blankly at the retreating crowd. His empire was gone. His reputation was ashes. He possessed no wealth, no leverage, and no future. He was completely bankrupt in every sense of the word. I did not linger to watch them suffer. The forensic execution was complete. The final boundary was drawn in ink and recorded in the state registry. I turned and walked toward the stage stairs, ready to leave the wreckage behind and return to the quiet sanctuary of my studio. 6 months have passed since the night the Albuquerque ballroom went silent. I did not linger in the aftermath of that evening. I walked out of the country club, stepped into the cool desert air, and let the heavy glass doors close behind me, sealing my father and sister inside the tomb of their own making. The drive back to Santa Fe was the most peaceful journey of my life. The frantic, vibrating tension that had plagued my existence for 28 years evaporated into the dark New Mexico sky, replaced by a profound and unshakable calm. I did not attend the bankruptcy hearings. I did not sit in the gallery during the federal arraignments. Patricia handled the structural dismantling with her usual surgical precision, acting as the impenetrable wall between my new life and their collapsing empire. I did not need to witness their ruin in person to know the severity of the consequences. The regional lenders seized the corporate accounts before the weekend was over. Victoria's tech startup was dissolved into liquid assets to pay pennies on the dollar to her unsecured creditors. She lost her vice president title, her corner office, and the pristine reputation she had weaponized against me for so long. The local business journals published the details of her insolvency on the front page, replacing the glossy, fabricated articles our father had purchased just days prior. Her illusion of superiority was permanently erased. William faced a much steeper and darker descent. The bank auditors uncovered the digital forgery within 48 hours of my announcement. The federal prosecutors did not offer a favorable plea deal for wire fraud and identity theft involving a multi-million-dollar commercial trust. His real estate development firm crumbled as investors fled the toxic fallout, terrified of being associated with a federal indictment. The man who had once lectured me about the value of time and equity was now facing a calendar measured in prison sentences. His bespoke suits and heavy gold watches were rendered entirely useless. His empire of zoning permits and leverage was reduced to a stack of legal filings. The Taos Heritage Trust, however, remained untouched by their destruction. As the primary secured creditor holding the defaulted note, I executed my legal right to protect the collateral. I transferred the historic Adobe estate out of the predatory lending ecosystem and placed it directly into my shielded entity. My grandfather's legacy was safe. The sprawling 20 acres of arid land, the ancient cottonwood trees, and the rugged shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains belonged to me. It was no longer a bargaining chip for corporate ambition. It was restored to its original purpose. It was a sanctuary. Back in my Canyon Road studio, the morning light poured through the skylights, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. The smell of roasted pine and raw linseed oil filled the room, familiar and grounding. I had changed my phone number. I had upgraded the security on the building. The outside noise was silenced. The only remaining tether to my past arrived through the postal service. Once a week, the mail carrier dropped a bundle of envelopes onto my welcome mat. Today, there were 3. 2 from Victoria. 1 from William, sent from a holding facility in the Southern District. I picked up the envelopes and carried them to my wooden desk. The return addresses were handwritten, lacking the expensive embossed corporate letterhead they used to flaunt. The handwriting was shaky, rushed, and stripped of all its former arrogance. I held the envelopes, feeling the thin, cheap paper between my paint-stained fingers. I did not need to open them to know what ink covered the pages inside. They would be filled with desperate, pleading paragraphs. They would attempt to invoke the hidden ledger of conditional love one final time, begging for financial relief, asking for a bridge loan for legal fees, promising that we could rebuild the family synergy. They would ask for a tearful reconciliation, hoping I still harbored the naive desire for their approval. But that hopeful, naive girl died the moment they tried to steal her future. I carried the unopened envelopes across the terracotta floor to the small Kiva fireplace in the corner of the studio. The cedar logs were already crackling, radiating a dry, comfortable heat. I tossed the letters directly into the flames. The paper curled instantly, turning black and flaking into ash, drifting up the chimney and vanishing into the clear sky. I watched the fire consume their words. I did not feel a single pang of guilt. Setting permanent boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of preservation. I turned away from the fire and walked toward the center of the room. My heavy wooden easel held a medium-sized canvas. It was an old piece, a dark, heavy charcoal sketch I had drafted years ago during a particularly bleak winter. The sketch depicted the sharp, rigid lines of my childhood home. It was a house defined by cold architecture, transactional relationships, and the suffocating pressure of my father's expectations. The piece was dominated by harsh shadows and rigid geometry, representing the cage they had expected me to inhabit. I stood before the canvas, holding a clean steel palette knife. Next to me, my glass mixing table was covered in fresh, wet oils. I did not reach for the dark umbers or the muted grays. I reached for a vibrant, saturated turquoise, the exact color of the desert sky at noon. I scooped a heavy dollop of the pigment onto the blade of the knife. I pressed the steel against the canvas, dragging the bright turquoise directly over the dark, rigid lines of my father's house. The thick oil paint buried the charcoal, erasing the sharp corners and the cold shadows. I layered sunset orange, rich ochre, and warm terracotta over the remnants of the old sketch. I worked with confident sweeping motions, trusting the strength in my calloused hands. The dark, oppressive image was steadily replaced by the sweeping, boundless curves of a desert landscape. I painted the Taos Mountains, capturing the raw, untamed spirit of the land my grandfather loved. I used my worn, cracked brushes to blend the colors, letting the bright hues bleed into one another. I was painting over my past, burying the toxic ledger under layers of vibrant, undeniable life. True success is a concept my family never understood. They believed success was a title printed on a business card. They believed it was a corner office, a luxury vehicle, and the ability to intimidate those around you. They spent their lives climbing a fragile ladder built on debt and deception, terrified of the moment it would inevitably break. They worshipped the illusion of power while ignoring the structural rot beneath their feet. They were wrong. True success is not a corporate title. It is the quiet, unbreakable power of building your own foundation. It is the ability to stand in a room you paid for, utilizing tools you earned, creating something that holds intrinsic, undeniable value. It is the profound peace of knowing that no one holds the deed to your identity. I set my palette knife down on the glass table. The vibrant southwest colors gleamed under the skylight, rich and alive. The dark house was entirely gone, replaced by a radiant horizon. My hands were covered in paint. My bank accounts were shielded and secure. My art was hanging in international galleries, commanding respect on my own terms. The air in the studio was cool and fragrant with sage. I looked out the large arched window, watching the tourists wander down Canyon Road, oblivious to the quiet victory residing behind the adobe walls. I wiped my hands on my denim apron, took a slow, deep breath of the clear desert air, and smiled. I was finally, irrevocably free. In American culture, the traditional family structure is often revered as the ultimate safety net, a bedrock of unconditional support built to withstand the harsh winds of the outside world. Yet beneath the manicured lawns and the perfectly curated holiday cards, a profoundly different reality often takes root. The story of Lyra Robert, a painter who methodically dismantled her father's fraudulent corporate empire using the very financial system he worshipped, is not merely a satisfying tale of forensic revenge. It is a deep, unflinching reflection on the spiritual and moral decay that occurs when a family replaces the heartbeat of unconditional love with the cold, calculating pulse of a financial ledger. For parents navigating the high-pressure, prestige-obsessed landscape of modern America, this narrative serves as a devastating cautionary tale. We live in a society that aggressively incentivizes conditional affection. It is dangerously easy for parents to equate their child's Ivy League degree, corporate title, or neighborhood zip code with their own success as caregivers. When William looked at his daughter Victoria, a vice president at a tech firm, he did not see a daughter. He saw a high-performing asset. When he looked at Lyra, a struggling artist with paint-stained hands, he saw a liability. This is the tragic failure of the transactional family. True parental responsibility is not defined by providing a trust fund, a networking opportunity, or a down payment on a house. It is defined by absolute honesty, unwavering fairness, and deep emotional awareness. It requires parents to recognize the unique, intrinsic value of their children's souls, rather than measuring their worth by how well they conform to a socially acceptable, easily monetized mold. When parents use guilt, financial leverage, and blatant favoritism to govern their household, they are not raising a family, they are running a cartel. And as William learned while standing paralyzed under the bright lights of a ballroom stage, if you raise your children in a ruthless marketplace, you cannot be surprised when they eventually hand you a legally binding invoice. From Lyra's arduous journey, a vital message emerges for the youth, especially those striving to carve out their own identities in a world that constantly demands scalable, conventional success. The lesson is simple, yet incredibly grueling. Your worth is not dictated by the people who refuse to see your light, even if those people share your last name. Young adults must understand that the most important infrastructure they will ever build is their own internal resilience. Lyra's ultimate power did not manifest suddenly with a multi-million-dollar wire transfer. Her power was forged in the quiet, unheated garage where she mixed her own pigments, hauled her own canvases, and weathered her family's disdain. It was built on the grit and determination to survive without a safety net. For the youth, the message is to trust your own calloused hands. Setting firm, unyielding boundaries with toxic family members is not an act of betrayal against traditional values. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You cannot paint your masterpiece on a canvas owned by someone who is actively trying to erase your signature. When we view this societal reality through the eyes of a spiritual practitioner, one who seeks the truth behind the veil of material illusion, the tragedy of the Robert family becomes a profound masterclass in the necessity of self-correction. Modern society is deeply intoxicated by the pursuit of external validation, treating bank accounts and social status as the ultimate forms of salvation. But true human elevation requires turning inward to cultivate three essential pillars: wisdom, morality, and willpower. William possessed immense material wealth, but he entirely lacked the wisdom to see the impermanence of his empire. Blinded by the hollow gleam of a gold Rolex and the desperate need to maintain his social facade, he allowed greed to rot his foundation. He lacked the morality to govern his actions, committing federal fraud to sustain an illusion. He planted seeds of deceit, and the universe, operating on the infallible law of cause and effect, delivered a harvest of absolute ruin. Lyra, conversely, embodies the spiritual triumph of willpower. She engaged in the most difficult form of self-correction, stripping away the toxic, deeply ingrained conditioning of her childhood to forge a life rooted in authentic truth. To live a better, more meaningful life, we must stop chasing the ghosts of societal approval. We must cultivate the moral fortitude to stand firmly in the light, possessing the wisdom to recognize that true wealth is a peaceful mind and the willpower to walk away from anything that threatens it. As we navigate the complex, often painful ledgers of our own lives, it is crucial to recognize these toxic patterns before they culminate in irreversible damage. We must learn to untangle our self-worth from the expectations of those who do not truly know us. If you find resonance in this struggle for authenticity, if you have ever had to systematically dismantle a false narrative built by those who claimed to love you, I encourage you to subscribe to Mourning Revenge. Join a community that understands the quiet, necessary power of taking back your own story, one boundary at a time. We are culturally conditioned to believe that family loyalty means standing by your blood regardless of the cost to your own soul. We are taught that forgiveness is the only morally acceptable path to peace, and that walking away is a fundamental failure of character. But here is a truth that violently opposes generations of conventional thinking. Sometimes, the highest form of love you can offer a profoundly broken system is to absolutely refuse to participate in its delusion. Sometimes, true loyalty means holding the people who share your DNA accountable to the devastating reality of their own actions. You do not owe your future to the people who actively tried to dismantle your past. As the dust settles on the shattered adobe facades of our own lives, we are left to look at the empty spaces remaining. Look closely at the walls of your own home, the hidden structures of your closest relationships, and the silent, invisible contracts you have signed without ever holding a pen. Are you standing in a sanctuary built on mutual respect, honesty, and unconditional truth? Or are you simply a tenant in someone else's carefully constructed illusion, quietly waiting for the day the bank finally comes to collect? The lock on the door is yours to turn. The only question that remains is which side of the threshold are you truly standing on?